The year is 2035. China's gleaming skyscrapers are half empty. Its ghost cities, once symbols of unstoppable growth, are crumbling. And that massive middle class that was supposed to power China's future? They're watching their savings disappear as property values collapse. Sounds crazy, right? After all, this is China we're talking about, the economic miracle that lifted 800 million people out of poverty, the country that built entire cities in months and became the world's factory floor. But here's the thing, China's miracle is running out of magic, and what's happening now isn't just a slowdown, it's the beginning of something much worse. We're watching the world's second largest economy start a long, painful slide back into poverty. Don't believe it? Let me show you why China's future looks a lot more like its past than anyone wants to admit. Let's start with something that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. China's real estate market, worth a staggering $50 trillion, is imploding. We're not talking about a minor correction here. This is a full-blown crisis that's erasing decades of wealth creation. Think about this. China has enough empty apartments to house 3 billion people. That's not a typo, 3 billion. Remember, China's total population is only 1.4 billion. They've literally built enough homes to house an extra China, and then some. But here's where it gets really wild. Meet Zhang Wei, a 35-year-old software engineer from Shenzhen. Back in 2020, he and his wife spent their life savings on a $400,000 apartment. They thought it was a safe investment. After all, Chinese property values had only gone up for decades. Now, that apartment's worth half what they paid. And they're not alone. Across China, middle-class families are watching their wealth evaporate. The numbers are staggering. In just the past 2 years, Chinese property prices have dropped by 30% in some cities. In places like Dongguan, once a booming tech hub, entire neighborhoods sit empty. Local real estate agents say they haven't made a sale in months. Remember Evergrande? It used to be China's biggest property developer. Now it's defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. But here's the scary part. Evergrande isn't the only one. Country Garden, another massive developer, just defaulted on $187 billion. Together, China's property developers owe more money than the entire GDP of France. And it's not just the big developers. The whole system is built on a house of cards. Chinese families have 70% of their wealth tied up in real estate, compared to just 35% in the United States. When property values fall, they don't just lose a little money, they lose everything. But the real estate crisis isn't just about money, it's about trust. See, Chinese developers had this crazy business model. They'd sell apartments before they were built, using the money from new buyers to finish projects for old buyers. It worked great as long as prices kept rising. But now, there are over 20 million pre-sold apartments that might never get finished. Imagine saving for years, finally buying your dream home, and then nothing. The construction stops, the developer disappears, your life savings are gone. That's happening to millions of Chinese families right now. And here's the kicker. Local governments are in on this too. They've been funding themselves by selling land to developers. With the property market frozen, their revenue has collapsed. Some cities have cut civil servant salaries. Others can't afford to maintain basic services. But that's just the beginning of China's problems. Because while everyone's been focused on those empty apartments, something even more dangerous has been happening. China's been losing its edge as the world's factory floor. Wait until you hear what's happening to China's manufacturing sector and why companies are racing to move their factories to places like Vietnam and Mexico. But first, we need to talk about the man who's accelerating China's decline and how this obsession with control is strangling the world's second largest economy. Meet Xi Jinping, the leader who's managed to do what decades of Western sanctions couldn't: cripple China's economic future. And he's done it in ways that would make Mao proud. Remember how China used to work? Local officials had the freedom to experiment with policies. Foreign investors were welcomed with open arms, and China's government mostly stayed out of private business. This system wasn't perfect, but it turned China into an economic powerhouse. Xi changed all that. Since taking power, he's rewired China's entire economy around a single principle: control. And I mean control of everything. Take Jack Ma, for example. He built Alibaba into China's Amazon and was worth over $800 billion. Then he made one speech criticizing financial regulators. What happened next? His company's IPO got canceled overnight. Regulators launched investigations, and he basically disappeared for months. Alibaba's value? It dropped by $400 billion. That's more than the entire value of Walmart, gone because one businessman spoke out of turn. And it gets worse. In 2023, Xi introduced an anti-espionage law so broad that even basic market research could get you arrested. Want to know how many gadgets a factory produces? Could be espionage. Want to survey Chinese consumers about their shopping habits? Might be a national security threat. The results were predictable. Foreign companies started pulling out. In 2023 alone, foreign investment in China dropped by 80%. Just let that sink in. Businesses would rather give up on the world's biggest market than deal with Xi's rules. But here's where Xi's really outdone himself. He's concentrated so much power in his own hands that even China's central bank needs his approval for major decisions. Remember how local officials used to have freedom to experiment? Now they're so scared of making mistakes that they won't make any decisions at all. This might sound like just political stuff, but it's having real economic impacts. Let me show you what I mean. In 2023, China reported 5.2% GDP growth. Look at this chart from the World Economic Forum. See how they're projecting growth to slow even further? But even these numbers don't tell the whole story. The government celebrated their 5.2% like it was proof their system was working. Western media outlets ran headlines about China's robust recovery. Even the IMF praised China's strong comeback. But here's what they're not telling you. China had to invest 40% of its entire GDP, twice what the US invests, just to get that growth. The numbers are brutal. China dumps $40 into the economy just to get $100 of growth. That's not an economy, that's a money pit. Want to see how crazy this gets? Let's look at just one example: high-speed rail. China's built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail lines, more than every other country in the world combined. Sounds impressive, right? But here's the catch: 80% of these lines lose money. The railway system's total debt? $900 billion. Some lines generate so little revenue they can't even afford their electricity bills. Or take the city of Tianjin. They spent $47 billion to build a world-class financial center. Today, most of the buildings are empty. The few companies that moved in are mostly state-owned enterprises forced to be there. It's like building a massive shopping mall in the middle of nowhere and then forcing government stores to open there. This isn't just happening in one city. Across China, local governments have built airports that never see planes, stadiums that never host games, and museums that never open. They're building stuff just to boost GDP numbers. Youth unemployment got so bad that China stopped publishing the numbers. It got so bad they just stopped releasing the numbers altogether. And remember those tech companies we talked about? The ones Xi cracked down on? In 2021 alone, his policies destroyed more value than the entire GDP of France. Hundreds of thousands of high-paying tech jobs vanished. Some of China's brightest minds, the people who were supposed to drive innovation and future growth, are now driving delivery bikes or selling street food. Here's why this matters. China's old model of growth, building stuff and exporting cheap goods, isn't working anymore. They need to shift to a consumer-driven economy like every other developed nation. But Xi's policies are doing the exact opposite. He's scaring away investors, crushing private business, and making it harder for regular Chinese people to make money. But if you think that's bad, wait until you see what's happening to China's local governments. Because while Beijing might be putting on a brave face, China's provinces are facing a financial crisis that makes America's 2008 meltdown look like a minor hiccup. Here's the thing about China's local governments. They've been running a giant pyramid scheme for decades. They'd buy land cheap from farmers, sell it expensive to developers, and use that money to fund everything from schools to subways. In good times, land sales provided up to 40% of their revenue. But remember those property developers we talked about? The ones going bankrupt? Well, they're not buying land anymore. And when nobody's buying land, local governments stop making money. It's that simple. Let me show you how bad this has gotten. In Henan province, civil servants had their salaries cut by 50%. In Guangdong, China's richest province, government workers are being forced to take pay cuts of up to 30%. Some cities can't even afford to keep their streetlights on at night. Take the city of Tianjin again. They're so desperate for money, they're selling off government buildings. The local government literally can't afford its own offices anymore. And they're one of the wealthy cities. Imagine how bad things are in poorer regions. But here's where it gets really scary. Chinese local governments have racked up $9 trillion in hidden debt. That's bigger than the economies of Japan and Germany combined. They used something called local government financing vehicles, basically special companies that could borrow money without it showing up on official books. Now these LGFVs, as they're called, are starting to default. In 2023, a financing vehicle in Yunnan province missed a payment on its bonds. It was the first default of its kind in China's history, but it won't be the last. Remember those basic services governments are supposed to provide? Schools, hospitals, road maintenance? Local governments are cutting back on all of that. And it's creating a dangerous feedback loop. When local governments cut spending, people lose jobs. When people lose jobs, they stop buying houses. When nobody buys houses, property prices fall more. When property prices fall, local governments make even less money from land sales, and round we go. But here's the real kicker. China's central government can't just bail everyone out. They've got their own problems. Between COVID spending, military buildups, and trying to prop up the economy, Beijing's coffers aren't as full as they used to be. You might be thinking, okay, but China still makes everything, right? They're still the world's factory floor? Well, about that. Because what's happening in China's manufacturing sector might be the biggest sign yet that China's heading back to poverty. Remember when Made in China was on everything you owned? Those days are ending. Let me show you why. Take Apple. They've been making iPhones in China since 2007. But in 2023, something remarkable happened. They started moving production to India. Not just a little bit either. By 2025, 25% of all iPhones will be made in India. That's a $50 billion shift away from China. And Apple isn't alone. Samsung, they've already left, moving their factories to Vietnam. Nike, they're making more shoes in Vietnam than China now. Even Chinese companies are getting out. BYD, China's biggest electric car maker, is building factories in Mexico and Thailand. The numbers are staggering. In 2023 alone, foreign companies announced 378 major factory relocations out of China. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. have tripled since 2018. Mexico's manufacturing sector is growing at its fastest rate in decades. Meanwhile, China's share of global exports has dropped for the first time in 40 years. But why is this happening? Well, it's not just one thing, it's a perfect storm. First, Chinese workers aren't cheap anymore. Average factory wages have tripled in the last decade. A factory worker in Vietnam cost half as much. In India, it's even less. Remember how China got rich by being the world's low-cost manufacturer? That advantage is gone. Second, Xi's policies have scared companies away. Remember that anti-espionage law we talked about? Well, imagine trying to run a factory when checking your own production numbers might be considered spying. Companies are tired of dealing with it. Third, China's population is aging fast. The number of working-age people in China has dropped by 40 million since 2012. That's like losing the entire workforce of Spain. And it's getting worse. China's workforce is shrinking by 3 million people every year. But here's what really keeps manufacturing executives up at night: the growing tension between China and the West. Companies learned a hard lesson during COVID. Depending too much on China is risky. Now, with talk of trade wars and sanctions, they're not taking chances. Look at what happened to China's semiconductor industry. In 2022, the U.S. banned the sale of advanced chip-making equipment to China. Overnight, China's plans to dominate the semiconductor industry were set back by years. Their most advanced chips are now 3 generations behind Taiwan's. The impact on Chinese workers has been devastating. In Dongguan, once known as the world's factory, thousands of factories have closed. The city's population has dropped by 10% as workers leave to find jobs elsewhere. Similar stories are playing out across China's manufacturing belt. And this isn't just about factory jobs. It's about the entire ecosystem of businesses that grew up around manufacturing. The restaurants that fed workers, the shops that sold them goods, the apartments they rented, all of that is starting to collapse. But if you think this manufacturing exodus is bad, wait until you hear about China's demographic nightmare. Because while factories can move back someday, China's population problem is about to make poverty inevitable. And when I say inevitable, I mean it's already happening. Here's a number that should terrify Xi Jinping. For every 17 people who die in China today, only 10 babies are being born. China's population isn't just shrinking, it's collapsing. In 2023 alone, China lost 2 million people. That's like losing the entire population of Slovenia in just 1 year. But it gets worse, much worse. By 2035, that's just 11 years from now, 1 in 3 Chinese people will be over 60. That means 400 million elderly people who need pensions, health care, and support. For comparison, that's more senior citizens than the entire population of the United States. But wait, you might be thinking, don't they have young people to support the elderly? Well, that's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean catastrophic. Remember that one-child policy China had for decades? Well, they're paying the price now. A typical family structure in China looks like this: 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and just 1 child. They call them 4-to-1 families. That 1 child is supposed to support 6 older people. It's mathematically impossible. And those young people, they're struggling. Let me show you something fascinating. And by fascinating, I mean terrifying. This graph tells the story better than I ever could. See that sharp line going up? That's China's urban youth unemployment rate. It hit a staggering 21.3% in June 2023, and then the line just stops. Why? Because China simply stopped publishing the numbers. They claimed they needed to improve their statistical methodology. Right, more like they needed to figure out how to make terrible numbers look less terrible. Independent estimates suggest the real rate is now closer to 30%. Even after they resumed reporting with their new methodology in December 2023, they somehow claimed unemployment had magically dropped to 14.9%. But here's the thing, they changed who counts as unemployed youth. Convenient, isn't it? Take Lu Ming, a 24-year-old engineering graduate in Shanghai. He's been looking for work for 8 months. His parents spent their savings on his education, hoping he'd support them in retirement. Instead, he's delivering food on an electric scooter, making barely enough to support himself. China's pension system is already cracking under the pressure. In 2022, 14 provinces reported pension shortfalls. By 2035, China's pension system will need an extra $300 billion every year just to stay afloat. That's more than China's entire military budget. But here's where demography becomes destiny. Remember how China got rich? Cheap labor. Lots of young workers willing to work in factories for low wages. In the 1980s, 8 working-age Chinese supported each retiree. Today, it's 4. By 2035, it'll be 2. That's not an economy that can support itself, let alone compete globally. And China can't immigrate its way out of this problem. Unlike America, which can attract talented people from around the world, China's strict controls and growing xenophobia make it an unattractive destination for immigrants. Instead, China's losing its best and brightest. In 2023, applications for immigration hit record highs. The wealthy are sending their kids abroad and moving their money with them. It's a brain drain and a capital drain happening at the same time. Think this is just a future problem? Think again. Because what's happening to China's social contract right now might be the biggest sign yet that poverty isn't just coming, it's already here. See, China's government had a deal with its people. It went something like this: give up political freedom, get economic prosperity in return. For 40 years, the deal worked. People got richer, lives got better, everyone was happy, or at least happy enough. But now, that deal is falling apart faster than a Chinese apartment building. Remember Zhang Wei, our software engineer from earlier? His parents lived through real poverty in the 1970s. They accepted authoritarian rule because their lives kept improving. Zhang accepted it because he thought he'd do even better than his parents. Instead, he's watching his property value collapse. His tech sector job isn't secure. His savings are worth less every day as the yuan weakens. And now he's wondering, what exactly is he giving up his freedom for? He's not alone. Across China, people are asking the same question. Young people call it lying flat, giving up on the rat race because they can't win anyway. They're refusing to buy homes, have kids, or work overtime. Some are even refusing to work at all. The numbers tell the story. China's manufacturing output is shrinking. Foreign investment is fleeing. The property market is in free fall. And consumer confidence? It's hit historic lows. Marriage rates have plunged 60% in the last decade. Birth rates have collapsed. People aren't just worried about the future, they're giving up on it. And Xi Jinping knows it. That's why he's doubling down on control. More surveillance, more censorship, more nationalism. He's trying to replace the economic dream with a political one. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But you can't eat nationalism. You can't live in it. You can't save it for retirement. This is how China becomes poor again. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Property values fall. Factories leave. Young people give up. Old people run out of savings. Local governments can't provide services. The middle class disappears. It's already happening. In 2023, the number of Chinese billionaires dropped by more than half. The middle class is shrinking for the first time since reforms began. Rural parents are pulling kids out of school because they can't afford tuition. This isn't just a crisis, it's the end of an era. The Chinese miracle is over. The economic model that lifted 800 million people out of poverty, it's broken, and there's no fixing it. Think about what that means for a second. The world's second largest economy, home to 1.4 billion people, is sliding back into poverty. Not because of war, not because of natural disasters, but because the very things that made China rich are now making it poor. The real estate bubble that created wealth is now destroying it. The demographic dividend that powered growth has turned into a demographic disaster. The authoritarian system that enabled rapid development is now strangling innovation. So what happens next? Well, that's where things get really interesting and scary. Because China's not going to get poor alone. When the world's second largest economy tanks, everyone feels it. Those supply chains you rely on, they're going to break. The cheap stuff at Walmart, it's going to get expensive. Those treasury bonds China owns, they might have to sell them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. China is facing disaster, not in some distant future, right now. For decades, we've heard about China's unstoppable rise, the economic miracle, the superpower in waiting, the country that's supposedly eating America's lunch while we argue on social media. But behind the gleaming skyscrapers lies a nation on the brink. What we're about to show you in this video will absolutely blow your mind, because the truth about China is far more shocking than anything you've been told. 50 million empty apartments threaten to wipe out the life savings of hundreds of millions of Chinese families. China imports 85% of its soybeans and could face mass starvation if those imports were cut off. The Chinese government destroyed its own tech industry, wiping out $1.5 trillion in market value overnight. And China's military, despite its massive size and budget, has a fatal flaw that makes it far weaker than it appears. And we're just getting started. As China's problems multiply, this weakness becomes increasingly dangerous for global stability. The signs of collapse are everywhere if you know where to look. let's dive in with the most visible crisis that's already sending shockwaves through China's economy. 1. Real estate apocalypse. China's economy is built on the largest real estate bubble in human history, and it's imploding right now. An astonishing 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied to real estate, according to the People's Bank of China, compared to just 25% in the U.S. Housing prices have fallen for 28 consecutive months, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, with no bottom in sight. The scale is mind-boggling. 60 to 80 million empty apartments as of August 2023, enough to house the entire population of Spain, sit unsold across the country. That's approximately $13 trillion of housing inventory going nowhere, according to Rogoff and Yang's research published in the American Economic Review. Major developers like Evergrande have collapsed, defaulting on over $300 billion in debt. Ghost cities stand half-finished, concrete skeletons abandoned mid-construction looking like something out of The Walking Dead. The situation has become so dire that homeowners have started mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay for homes that will never be completed. Over 400 stalled projects across 86 cities have seen payment strikes, according to researchers at the University of Hong Kong. When millions of families realize their life savings are evaporating, social unrest will follow, and it's already beginning. But what's happening with housing is just the tip of the iceberg. The debt situation beneath the surface is beyond comprehension. 2. Mountains of debt. China's debt-to-GDP ratio has soared to a staggering 345%, according to the Institute of International Finance, significantly worse than the United States, 123%, or Japan, 266%. Every year, China prints more fake growth to keep the economy afloat, but the debt is piling up faster than the economy is growing. It's like watching someone dig a hole to get out of a hole. The numbers will shock you. According to the Bank for International Settlements, China added $45 trillion in debt since 2008, equivalent to creating an economy the size of Germany every 2 years, but all on borrowed money. The game works like this. When the economy slows, the government orders banks to lend more money to build more things, mostly unnecessary infrastructure and empty housing. This creates jobs and boosts GDP statistics temporarily, but saddles the country with ever-increasing debt. It's like using one credit card to pay off another. It works until it doesn't. And when it finally stops working, the collapse will be spectacular. What's happening at the local level is even more alarming than the national crisis. 3. Local governments are bankrupt. China's local governments owe over $12.3 trillion, according to Goldman Sachs, and they've run out of ways to pay it back. For years, these governments relied on selling land to developers. But with the real estate market collapsing, that revenue stream has dried up. Land sales revenue plummeted by 38% in 2023, according to China's Ministry of Finance, the largest drop in a decade. The results are catastrophic. Cities can't pay salaries. Hospitals are running out of cash. In Hainan province, government workers have seen their salaries cut by 50%. In others, public servants are being paid in groceries instead of money. The numbers are staggering. Local governments spent approximately $1.3 trillion on zero COVID measures in 2022 alone, according to the Financial Times. Money they simply didn't have. They're now sitting on debt equal to 76% of China's entire GDP. So where do desperate local governments turn when they need cash? To banks, of course. But China's banking system is hiding a secret that will leave you speechless. 4. Banking crisis. China's banks are sitting on a powder keg of bad loans that threatens to detonate the entire financial system. According to the Bank for International Settlements, non-performing loans in China are actually closer to 20% of GDP, about 10 times what official figures admit. That's $3.8 trillion in loans that will never be repaid, enough to bankrupt the entire banking system several times over. Meanwhile, legitimate small businesses can't access capital. The system is designed to keep the facade intact.
not to create actual growth. Bank runs have already started in smaller regional banks. In Henan province, depositors found their life savings frozen, prompting rare public protests. When they tried to withdraw their money, their health QR codes mysteriously turned red, preventing them from traveling to bank branches. This might sound like conspiracy theory stuff, but it actually happened. The government literally used COVID tracking apps to stop people from withdrawing their money. If that doesn't terrify you, nothing will. People are losing faith in the system. When trust in banks evaporates, the financial system collapses. But there's an even more fundamental crisis threatening China's future. The country itself is disappearing at an alarming rate. 5. Population collapse. China's birth rate has fallen to a record low of 6.39 births per 1,000 people, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, less than half the rate needed for population replacement. Despite abandoning the one-child policy, young Chinese couples simply aren't having babies. Housing costs are too high, education is too expensive, and work pressure is too intense. The truth is shocking. China's population declined by 1.39 million people in 2024 alone, marking the third consecutive year of decline, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. The rate of decline is accelerating, driven by the lasting effects of the one-child policy and rising economic pressures on families. By 2100, China's population could shrink to around 633 million, according to UN projections, less than half its current size. A shrinking population means fewer consumers, fewer workers, and fewer innovators. No economy can grow long-term with a rapidly declining population. It's basic math. And here's where things get truly terrifying. This population collapse isn't just a future problem. China's workforce is already vanishing at a rate that defies belief. 6. China's workforce collapse. China's working-age population peaked at 997 million in 2014 and has been shrinking ever since, according to Statista. By 2050, China will have 217 million fewer workers, according to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a drop larger than the entire U.S. workforce. By 2050, China will have more retirees than the entire population of the United States. These aren't projections from Western think tanks with an agenda. These are China's own numbers. China is facing the prospect of getting old before it gets rich, a demographic trap no major economy has successfully escaped. It's like trying to save for retirement after you've already retired. The most devastating part? The workforce collapse is hitting just as youth unemployment reaches crisis levels. 7. Unemployment nightmare. China's youth unemployment hit a staggering 21.3% in June 2024, according to Trading Economics. The situation became so embarrassing that Beijing simply stopped publishing the numbers. Tens of millions of college graduates can't find jobs matching their education. They've coined a term for themselves, full-time children, moving back in with parents after failing to launch careers. The numbers are jaw-dropping. In 2023, China produced 11.6 million college graduates, according to China's Ministry of Education. At current unemployment rates, about 2.5 million of them are jobless, creating a dangerous pool of educated, ambitious, and deeply frustrated young people. Throughout history, unemployed youth have been the kindling for political upheaval. The Arab Spring didn't start with middle-aged people complaining about politics. It started with young, educated people who couldn't find jobs. The social contract in China has always been simple: sacrifice political freedom for economic opportunity. But what happens when that economic opportunity disappears? The answer will reshape global politics for decades. But the worst part is yet to come. With so many unemployed young people, you'd expect China's manufacturing sector to be thriving. Instead, something unprecedented is happening that's sending shockwaves through the global economy. 8. Factories are leaving China. China was the world's factory, but companies are fleeing in droves at a pace that's hard to comprehend. Apple is aggressively shifting iPhone production to India. with plans to produce 25% of all iPhones in India by 2025, according to JP Morgan. Nike and Adidas have moved much of their manufacturing to Vietnam. U.S. imports from China dropped by 22% between 2022 and 2024, according to U.S. Census Bureau data. This exodus is happening for multiple reasons: rising labor costs as China's workforce shrinks, increasing government interference in business operations, growing fears about a potential conflict over Taiwan that could disrupt supply chains overnight. The numbers are brutal. Foreign direct investment in China plunged 80% in 2023, according to the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, reaching its lowest level since the 1990s. This isn't a blip. It's the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of global supply chains away from China. Once a company leaves, it rarely comes back. Each factory that relocates represents not just current job losses, but future opportunities that China will never see. The World Factory label made China rich. Losing it will make China poor. But that's nothing compared to what China did to its own tech sector. What comes next will make your jaw drop. 9. Tech collapse. For years, China's tech sector rivaled Silicon Valley. Companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance appeared unstoppable. Then the government destroyed them in what might be the most spectacular act of economic self-sabotage in modern history. Xi Jinping feared tech giants had too much power, so he launched a brutal crackdown that wiped out over $1.5 trillion in market value from Chinese tech companies, according to Bloomberg. That's the equivalent of erasing the entire economies of Australia and New Zealand combined, overnight. Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, vanished for months after criticizing government regulators. When he reappeared, his company was being dismantled. The gaming industry lost billions after strict regulations limited playing time for minors and froze new game approvals. China's AI and semiconductor development has been crippled by U.S. export controls. Despite pouring $50 billion into chip manufacturing, China remains 5 to 7 years behind Taiwan and the U.S., according to the Semiconductor Industry Association. In 2021, China ranked number 1 globally in tech IPOs. By 2023, Chinese tech IPOs had plunged 87%, according to data from Refinitiv. You can build the tech sector in decades, but you can destroy one in months. But all these economic problems pale in comparison to a much more fundamental threat, one that's literally drying up before our eyes. 10. Water crisis. China is running out of water, and the consequences are more severe than anyone wants to admit. According to China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment, 86% of groundwater in major agricultural regions is polluted, much of it too contaminated for any use. The Yellow River, which supports 160 million people, is drying up, losing 15% of its flow since the 1990s, according to research published in the Journal of Hydrology. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces such severe water shortages that the World Resources Institute identifies it as one of the most water-stressed regions on Earth. Water tables are dropping by 3 feet per year, according to research published in Nature. Without water, China's farms and factories will grind to a halt. Cities will become unlivable. You can print money, but you can't print rainfall. The numbers are staggering. China has 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of its fresh water. 12 of China's 23 provinces face extreme water stress, according to the World Resources Institute. This isn't just an environmental issue. It's an existential threat to China's survival as a unified nation. And it leads directly to perhaps the most shocking vulnerability in China's entire system. 11. China can't feed itself. Despite all its economic power, China has a deadly secret. It cannot feed its own people. The country imports 85% of its soybeans, according to the USDA, 15% of its rice, and depends heavily on foreign food to survive. If a war, pandemic, or climate disaster disrupts these imports, China faces mass food shortages that would make empty grocery shelves during COVID look like a minor inconvenience. China's food imports have skyrocketed 1,000% since 2000 according to UN Comtrade data. The country spent $140 billion on imported food in 2023 alone, more than any other nation on Earth. Food security isn't just an economic issue, it's existential. Throughout Chinese history, dynasties have fallen when they've failed to feed the population. The Chinese Communist Party knows this well. It rose to power during a period of widespread hunger. A country that can't feed itself is perpetually vulnerable. No matter how many aircraft carriers China builds, it can't escape this basic reality. You can't eat aircraft carriers. And speaking of vulnerabilities, there's another resource crisis that keeps Chinese leaders awake at night. 12. Energy dependence. China depends heavily on foreign energy in ways that create critical strategic weaknesses. The country imports 73% of its oil according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, much of it through sea lanes that could be easily disrupted in a conflict. China's Strategic Petroleum Reserve can only cover about 80 days of imports according to the International Energy Agency, well below the 90-day minimum recommended for energy security. In a scenario where China faced a naval blockade, its economy would literally shut down within months. Factories would close, transportation would halt, cities would go dark. The numbers are alarming. China's oil import dependency has grown from 30% in 2000 to 73% today, according to China's National Energy Administration. Despite massive investments in renewable energy, China still gets 56% of its energy from coal, much of it imported. This vulnerability shapes China's military planning and foreign policy. It's why China has invested heavily in its navy and built artificial islands in the South China Sea. But the fundamental weakness remains. China needs energy imports to survive. All these economic and resource problems are creating something the Chinese government fears more than anything else. 13. Crime and social unrest. As economic pressures mount social stability, the Chinese government's highest priority is fraying in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. According to the China Labor Bulletin, protests and labor disputes increased by 30% in 2023 compared to 2022. Workers riot over unpaid wages. Homeowners demonstrate when their half-built apartments are abandoned. The middle class protest when their bank deposits are frozen. What's truly shocking, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China spends $216 billion on internal security compared to $209 billion on its military. That's right, China spends more money controlling its own people than it does preparing for external threats. In Xinjiang province alone, China has detained over 1 million Uyghurs, according to UN estimates. Ethnic tensions simmer beneath the surface in Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and other regions. The social contract that maintained stability for decades, economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is breaking down as the economy falters. And when that social contract fully dissolves, the consequences will reshape global politics. But China's problems aren't just domestic. Its ambitious plan to dominate the global economy is facing a catastrophic failure that will leave you stunned. 14. Belt and Road failure. China's Belt and Road Initiative was supposed to be Xi Jinping's legacy, a global infrastructure network extending Chinese influence across continents. Instead, it's becoming a financial disaster of historic proportions. Partner countries are defaulting on Chinese loans, leaving China with trillions in unpaid debts, according to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The numbers are staggering. China has lent over $1 trillion to more than 150 countries, much of it to nations that can't possibly repay. Sri Lanka couldn't repay its loans and was forced to hand over a strategic port to China for 99 years. Pakistan, one of China's closest allies, has repeatedly asked to restructure its Chinese debt. Over 40% of Pakistan's external debt is owed to China, according to the World Bank. According to research from aid data, 42 countries now have debt exposure to China exceeding 10% of their GDP. Many of these loans were made with predatory terms, including collateral requirements that let China seize assets when countries default. What was meant to expand China's power has instead drained its resources and generated resentment. Belt and Road countries increasingly view China as a predatory lender, not a benevolent partner. But China's global strategy isn't the only thing failing. Its core economic engine, exports, is sputtering in ways that threaten the entire system. 15. Collapsing exports and trade war pressure. China's once booming exports are under unprecedented pressure from all sides. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, U.S. tariffs now cover 66.4% of Chinese imports, up from just 7.5% in 2018. The European Union has imposed anti-dumping duties on everything from electric vehicles to solar panels. India and Vietnam are rapidly replacing China in key manufacturing sectors. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. have grown by 180% since 2018, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. India has overtaken China as the world's fastest-growing major economy. China's trade surplus fell by 30% in the first half of 2024 compared to the same period in 2023, according to data from China's General Administration of Customs. Chinese exports to the U.S. have fallen from $540 billion in 2018 to $427 billion in 2023, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. China built its economy on exports. Now the world is moving on, and there's no plan B. But if all these economic, demographic, and resource problems weren't enough, China faces another threat that might be the most dangerous of all. 16. Xi Jinping's total control. Xi Jinping has eliminated rivals and consolidated more power than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, making China effectively a one-man dictatorship. This might sound like strength, but it's actually China's greatest vulnerability. When all decisions flow through one person, the system becomes brittle. Subordinates fear delivering bad news. Alternative viewpoints are suppressed. Reality itself becomes distorted as it travels up the chain of command. According to the Congressional Research Service, Xi holds at least 12 top leadership positions, giving him unprecedented control over the party, state, and military. He's extended his rule indefinitely, removing the term limits that ensured regular leadership transitions. The consequences are dire. Economic policy blunders like the tech crackdown and zero COVID devastated China's economy. According to the World Bank, zero COVID alone cost China $4 trillion in lost economic output, all because no one could tell Xi it wasn't working. But this creates a dangerous dynamic. When everything is your decision, everything is your fault. As China's problems multiply, there's no one left to blame but Xi himself. And now for perhaps the most surprising fact of all, one that completely contradicts China's carefully cultivated image as a military superpower. 17. Military failures. Despite its impressive military parades and growing defense budget, China's military has a fatal flaw. It has never fought a modern war. The People's Liberation Army hasn't engaged in large-scale combat since a brief border war with Vietnam in 1979, and that didn't go well for China. Today's PLA officers have risen through the ranks based on political loyalty, not battlefield experience. Corruption remains rampant in the military despite purges and crackdowns. According to a RAND Corporation study, paid promotions, embezzlement, and kickbacks from defense contractors continue to undermine readiness. In 2022 alone, more than 60 senior military officers were investigated for corruption, according to China's Central Military Commission. Chinese soldiers lack real combat experience and train in highly scripted exercises designed to look good for political leaders rather than develop actual fighting capabilities. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's annual report to Congress, China's military training remains focused on choreographed demonstrations rather than realistic combat scenarios. Even China's growing naval power, often cited as evidence of its rising threat, has never been tested in combat conditions. Building ships is one thing, operating them effectively under fire is quite another. This military inexperience becomes especially concerning when you consider how these other 16 crises might push China's leadership toward a conflict as a distraction from domestic problems. History shows that failing regimes often look outward for enemies when facing collapse at home, and rarely has a major power faced so many simultaneous crises as China does today. The cracks in China's facade aren't just appearing, they're spreading rapidly across every sector of society and economy. From ghost cities to rivers running dry, from banks hiding bad loans to factories fleeing overseas, these aren't isolated problems that can be fixed with a 5-year plan. The China we thought we knew, the economic juggernaut destined to overtake America, was built on unsustainable foundations. The real estate bubble, demographic collapse, debt crisis, water shortages, and technological setbacks aren't separate challenges. They're interconnected failures in a system that's reaching its breaking point. History teaches us that no economic miracle lasts forever. The Soviet Union appeared unstoppable until it collapsed virtually overnight. Japan seemed destined to dominate the global economy until its bubble burst in the 1990s. China's trajectory may prove no different, except the scale of its problems dwarfs anything we've seen before. The implications stretch far beyond China's borders. Global supply chains, financial markets, and geopolitical alignments would all be transformed by China's decline. The question isn't whether China faces serious problems, the evidence is overwhelming that it does. The real question is how rapidly these crises will accelerate, and what that means for global stability. What do you think? Which of these facts shocked you the most? Can China somehow overcome these challenges? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a historic collapse? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out China's collapse into poverty is worse than you think, or click this other video instead. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn that notification bell on so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos.
They said it would connect the world. Instead, it's collapsing, literally. November 2024, a concrete canopy crashes down at a railway station in Serbia, killing 16 people. The renovation was part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the trillion-dollar project that was supposed to reshape global trade. December 2023, Italy officially withdraws from the BRI, calling it a big mistake. The only G7 nation to join becomes the first to quit. January 2024, protesters flood the streets of Gwadar, Pakistan, demanding Chinese companies leave their port city. This isn't what Xi Jinping envisioned when he launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Back then, it was hailed as the project of the century, a new Silk Road that would lift entire continents out of poverty and cement China's role as a global superpower. But today, the BRI is crumbling faster than those Chinese-built projects themselves. In 2024, Chinese BRI engagement reached record highs of over $70 billion. Yet the initiative is facing unprecedented challenges. Countries are defaulting, projects are stalling, and Beijing's grand vision is turning into a geopolitical nightmare. From debt traps in Sri Lanka to corruption scandals in Ecuador, we're about to expose the shocking truth behind China's trillion-dollar gamble and why it's become one of the most humiliating foreign policy disasters in modern history. Because what we're about to discover will change how you see China's global ambitions forever. To understand how spectacularly the BRI has failed, we need to go back to the beginning, to 2013, when Xi Jinping stood before the world and painted a picture of unprecedented global cooperation. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just another infrastructure program. It was Xi's signature project, his bid to position China as the benevolent leader of a new world order. The plan was breathtaking in scope. Between 140 and 150 countries would participate, representing almost 75% of the world's population and more than half of global GDP. Beijing promised highways slicing through mountains, railways linking continents, and deep seaports transforming remote coastlines into global trade hubs. Since its establishment in 2013, cumulative BRI engagement reached $1.175 trillion, with about $704 billion in construction contracts and $470 billion in non-financial investments. The timing seemed perfect. Across the developing world, countries desperately needed infrastructure but couldn't secure funding from traditional sources. Western banks saw too much risk. China saw an opportunity. For poor nations, it looked like a miracle. Finally, someone was offering them the roads, ports, and power plants they needed to join the modern economy. No lengthy approval processes, no complex conditions, just Chinese money, Chinese workers, and Chinese promises of prosperity. The early years were intoxicating. High-speed rail lines transformed travel times across Southeast Asia. Modern ports in Africa began handling international shipping. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor promised to revolutionize the entire region with $60 billion in investment. Xi Jinping basked in the global praise. Here was proof that China's rise could benefit everyone, a stark contrast to America's military interventions and Europe's colonial legacy. But beneath the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and glowing headlines, warning signs were already emerging. Local communities weren't benefiting from these mega-projects. Environmental damage was widespread. And most troubling of all, the debt was piling up faster than anyone had anticipated. Still, China pressed ahead. The BRI had become too big to fail, or so Beijing thought. What they didn't realize was that they were building the foundations of their own humiliation. The first cracks in China's grand vision appeared in the most dramatic way possible. Countries started surrendering their sovereignty. Sri Lanka became the poster child for what critics called debt trap diplomacy. Between 2007 and 2012, Sri Lanka secured loans worth over $1 billion from China's Exim Bank to finance the construction of Hambantota Port, despite widespread doubts about the project's profitability. The port was doomed from the start. Sri Lanka initially approached other potential creditors, including India and the Asian Development Bank, but failed to secure financing due to concerns over the port's viability. Ultimately, the Rajapaksa government turned to China, which offered loans at significantly higher interest rates, around 6.3%, compared to the 3% the ADB would have charged. When the port failed to generate revenue and Sri Lanka couldn't service its debts, Beijing made an offer Colombo couldn't refuse: hand over the port for 99 years in exchange for debt relief. China would cancel $1.1 billion off Sri Lanka's debt to China in exchange for the port. But Sri Lanka wasn't alone in this nightmare. Zambia tells an even more devastating story. Once hailed as one of Africa's success stories, Zambia borrowed billions from China for infrastructure projects. In 2020, Zambia became the first African country to default on its BRI loans. Chinese debt had grown to 43% of Zambia's national income, and when the country ran out of money, the fallout was severe. Inflation hit 16.5% in April 2025, and 5.8 million Zambians fell into food insecurity. The human cost was staggering. Families watched their savings evaporate as the currency collapsed. Children dropped out of school because their parents couldn't afford fees. Essential services were cut as the government struggled to pay even basic expenses. Pakistan's experience with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor reveals another layer of the BRI's failures. By 2022, CPEC had created only a fraction of the jobs promised, and Pakistan's debt repayment obligations to China are mounting. In the port city of Gwadar, there have been large protests against power and water shortages and the presence of Chinese companies, a growing backlash against China's multi-billion-dollar projects. Local fishermen found their livelihoods destroyed by Chinese trawlers, while promised development never materialized. But here's what makes this even more shocking. While these countries were drowning in debt, Chinese officials were getting rich off the chaos. In Montenegro, a tiny Balkan nation of just 620,000 people, China financed what would become one of the BRI's most embarrassing failures. Montenegro borrowed $1 billion, a third of its entire economy, to build a highway. That highway? It literally leads to nowhere. If you want to see the BRI's failures with your own eyes, Montenegro's Highway to Nowhere is the perfect place to start. China financed the first 41-kilometer segment of a highway through mountainous terrain at a cost of nearly $1 billion. When that initial stretch opened in 2022, it literally petered out in a rural field with no continuation.
Montenegro's debt soared to 80% of GDP, and it can't afford to finish the road. Imagine borrowing a third of your country's entire economic output to build a road that goes nowhere. That's not infrastructure development. That's a monument to failed planning. But Montenegro's highway is just one of dozens of white elephant projects littering the BRI landscape. Sri Lanka's Madala Rajapaksa International Airport stands as perhaps the most absurd example. Billed as a second international gateway, it turned into the world's emptiest airport. Few flights land there, and it operates at a tiny fraction of capacity. The White Elephant Airport is so underused that wild elephants wander the empty runways. Think about that image for a moment. Wild elephants roaming freely through an international airport because there are no planes to disturb them. It's almost poetic, nature reclaiming a project that never should have existed. In Kenya, the Chinese-built railway from Nairobi to Mombasa has become a financial black hole. The railway ran into huge operating losses and was criticized for its high cost. Passengers struggled to afford tickets on a line that was supposed to boost economic growth. Environmental destruction has accompanied these infrastructure failures across the globe. In Indonesia, Chinese BRI investment fueled the nickel mining boom. Rainforests were clear-cut and ecosystems devastated to supply nickel for China's electric vehicle battery industry. The human cost has been equally devastating. Construction of railways and mines led to land grabs and displacement in countries like Pakistan and Laos. Promised jobs for locals often failed to materialize, as Chinese companies imported their own workers or the projects were ill-suited to local skills. In parts of Africa, Chinese-built hospitals remained empty because local staff was inadequately trained to run them. Imagine the cruel irony. New hospitals that can't treat patients because no one thought to train local doctors and nurses. But the corruption that enabled these disasters goes even deeper than anyone imagined. In Ecuador, engineers discovered something terrifying about the massive Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam, a $2.6 billion project hailed as a flagship BRI achievement. Engineers discovered 17,000 cracks in its structure. The dam, sitting at the foot of an active volcano, now operates at only partial capacity and is at risk of failure or collapse. How did this happen? Because Chinese contractors paid $76 million in bribes to Ecuadorian officials, reaching up to a former vice president, to secure the lucrative dam contract. Corners were cut, quality was ignored, and now an entire region lives under the threat of potential catastrophe. This wasn't development, it was exploitation disguised as partnership. By 2023, the cracks in China's Belt and Road Initiative had become impossible to hide. Countries that once eagerly welcomed Chinese investment were now scrambling to escape their BRI commitments. The most humiliating blow came from an unexpected source: Italy. Italy has withdrawn from China's Belt and Road Initiative more than 4 years after becoming the only group of 7 nations to sign up. For the past year, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has indicated that joining the BRI was a big mistake that she intended to correct by withdrawing from the initiative. The irony was devastating for Beijing. Italy wasn't some developing nation desperate for infrastructure. It was a founding member of NATO, the world's third largest economy in Europe and a key Western ally. When Italy joined the BRI in 2019, it was seen as a major diplomatic coup for China. Many Italian officials, including Minister of Foreign Affairs Antonio Tajani, stated that the BRI has not yielded the expected economic benefits for Italy. The 2019 agreement was set to expire in March 2024 with automatic renewal unless Rome provided 3 months written notice of withdrawal. What did Italy get from 4 years in the BRI? Virtually nothing. Italy's exports to China remain a very small share of total exports, while China's influence in Italian ports and infrastructure grew significantly. But Italy's exit was just the beginning of a global backlash. Malaysia launched corruption investigations into BRI projects, ultimately canceling 2 Chinese pipeline projects amid corruption investigations, and renegotiated the cost of a major rail link to nearly half the original price due to overpricing concerns. Myanmar froze the $3.6 billion Milestone Dam project after public protest.
and is renegotiating a proposed BRI deep sea port to avoid an unsustainable $7 billion debt. Sierra Leone canceled a $300 million Chinese airport deal in 2018, calling it unnecessary. Even Bangladesh and Nepal have withdrawn from certain BRI projects over debt and sovereignty worries. The numbers tell the story of China's retreat. Chinese overseas lending for BRI peaked around 2016 and then plummeted as many loans soured. In 2022, 60% of China's overseas lending went to borrowers in financial distress, compared to just 5% in 2010. The scale of the financial devastation is staggering. By 2023, at least a dozen countries were either in default or renegotiating Chinese debts. And extreme public debt driven by BRI has pushed several poor nations to the brink of bankruptcy. Beijing's loans often come with secret contract terms that prioritize Chinese repayment above other creditors, ensuring Beijing gets paid first even as host nations suffer austerity and instability. The BRI had become a global symbol not of Chinese generosity, but of Chinese exploitation. Behind every failed BRI project lies a web of corruption that makes the mafia look like amateur hour. The Democratic Republic of Congo reveals the true scale of Chinese corruption. Chinese state companies pledged $3 billion of roads and facilities in exchange for mining rights, but built less than $1 billion worth before stalling. Meanwhile, they paid $55 million in bribes to the then-President Joseph Kabila's entourage to protect their interests. Malaysia witnessed one of the most brazen abuses. Former Prime Minister Najib Razak allegedly arranged inflated BRI projects to embezzle funds to cover up debts from the 1MDB corruption scandal. Chinese officials helped conceal the theft of as much as $1 billion via those projects. As the former president of China's Export-Import Bank put it, if the water is too clear, you don't catch any fish. Beijing's hands-off approach enabled unscrupulous officials to profit personally, creating high-profile, low-quality projects that left local populations paying the price through debt and poor services. While Beijing marked the BRI as green and sustainable, the environmental reality has been an ecological nightmare. China funded dozens of coal-fired power plants across Asia and Africa, locking countries into high-carbon energy. Even after Xi announced in 2021 that China would stop building coal plants abroad, projects already in the pipeline have continued. In January 2024, a 380 MW coal-fired power plant started operating in Sulawesi, Indonesia. The dam disasters reveal another layer of recklessness. Similar cracks have been reported in Chinese-built dams in Uganda and Pakistan, raising safety fears. In Myanmar, the planned Myitsone Dam would have flooded a huge area and displaced thousands. Often, local people bore the social costs while seeing few benefits. Faced with this mounting disaster, Beijing has been forced into an embarrassing retreat. But rather than admit failure, China has tried to rebrand the BRI as BRI 2.0, a supposedly more sustainable, responsible version of the original. The era of lavish mega-projects, huge ports, cross-country railways, and giant highways is waning. Xi Jinping himself has been forced to change his rhetoric. At the 2023 forum, Xi Jinping told the participants that China will pursue high-quality, sustainable cooperation, a tacit admission that the earlier binge led to waste. The new strategy focuses on damage control. From 2020 to 2023, Beijing quietly negotiated dozens of debt rescheduling deals, for example, giving Zambia a grace period and longer maturity and temporarily suspending Sri Lanka's debt payments during its crisis. But even these relief efforts come with strings attached. China often drives a hard bargain, even in relief, insisting its loans be repaid first or in full, and sometimes asking for additional guarantees. Beijing has also tried to shift focus away from massive infrastructure toward digital projects and renewable energy. Rather than focus only on traditional infrastructure, steel and concrete, China is putting more emphasis on digital infrastructure, technology, and energy in BRI. This so-called digital Silk Road means installing fiber optic networks, data centers, telecom equipment, surveillance systems, and other high-tech projects in partner countries. China's energy-related engagement in 2024 was the greenest in absolute and relative terms in any period since the BRI's inception, reaching $11.8 billion, an increase of 60% compared to 2023. The BRI's collapse has triggered a complete realignment of global power dynamics that Beijing never saw coming. Meanwhile, Western powers have finally woken up to challenge China's infrastructure dominance. The United States and Europe have launched alternative initiatives. The G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, a $600 billion plan, and the EU's Global Gateway Program both aim to offer transparent, high-standard infrastructure financing to developing countries. These programs promise to avoid the mistakes of BRI by providing grants or low-interest loans with safeguards, anti-corruption, environmental standards. But critics note they are late to the game. China spent a decade and over $1 trillion building relationships across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, while Western efforts are just ramping up. China's BRI has also pushed countries into new camps. As Russia became isolated due to its war in Ukraine, Moscow leaned heavily towards Beijing. The two have talked up linking Russia's Eurasian Economic Union infrastructure plans with the new BRI. New rail lines and pipelines are being developed from Russia to China, creating an economic alliance that could challenge American dominance for decades. This strengthening Sino-Russian axis, partially facilitated by BRI connectivity, is one factor fueling talk of a new Cold War dividing the world. But the geopolitical damage to China's reputation may be irreversible. At the 10-year mark of BRI, celebrated in Beijing in October 2023, fewer foreign leaders showed up than China hoped. Many Western-aligned leaders stayed away, especially after China's no-limits friendship with Russia during the Ukraine war made BRI look politically charged. Vladimir Putin was an honored guest at the forum, underlining the emerging BRI alignment with anti-Western partners. But that only deepened skepticism elsewhere. The BRI has become a symbol not of China's rise, but of its overreach. After a decade and over $1 trillion, the Belt and Road Initiative stands as one of the most spectacular foreign policy failures in modern history. The numbers are damning. In 2023, China's policy banks only committed to lending $4.6 billion to African countries versus a commitment of $16.2 billion in 2018. FDI flows to all countries declined from a peak of $196 billion in 2016 to $177 billion in 2023, according to Economics Observatory. But the scale of the crisis goes beyond just declining investment. There has been a rise in emergency rescue lending for those countries whose financial stability was affected by the pandemic. In the last decade, there has been a retrenchment of China's overseas lending, as well as a slowdown of its investment, driven by domestic and external factors. China has had to commit more money to the project, expose itself to further risk, and has had to become entangled in complex local politics. For China itself, a report from Fitch Ratings doubts Chinese banks' ability to control risks, as they do not have a good record of allocating resources efficiently at home. What went wrong? The BRI collapsed because it was never really about development. It was all about control. Beijing designed the BRI to serve China's interests first, exporting excess industrial capacity, securing access to raw materials, and expanding geopolitical influence. The needs of partner countries were secondary considerations at best. The corruption was systematic and widespread. Beijing's policy banks and state firms often negotiated BRI loans in secret with local elites without open bidding or public oversight. This opacity was by design. Chinese lenders rarely disclosed loan terms, and host government officials often found it convenient to bypass accountability. The environmental and social costs were ignored. Projects were rushed through without proper environmental impact assessments or community consultation. Local populations bore the cost, while elites captured the benefits. Most fundamentally, the BRI failed because it was built on an obsolete model of development, one where rich countries impose grand plans on poor countries without genuine partnership or accountability. Behind every failed BRI project are real people whose lives have been shattered by China's broken promises. In Central Asia, collective debt to Beijing reached $15.7 billion by 2023, representing 7.6% of the region's external debt. Kazakhstan alone owes $9.2 billion as of January 1, 2024, primarily to China's Export-Import Bank, Exim Bank. The social consequences have been devastating. In 2018, over 30,000 Chinese migrants arrived in Kyrgyzstan for BRI projects, leading to rising anti-Chinese sentiments. Families have watched traditional livelihoods disappear as Chinese companies move in, while fishing communities have seen their catch diminish as Chinese operations pollute waterways. As one observer wryly noted, the BRI often built highways to nowhere in the developing world, illustrating how poorly conceived projects can fail spectacularly. The broader implications are profound. China's reputation as a responsible global power has been severely damaged. Developing countries have learned hard lessons about the risks of dependence on any single creditor, and the international community has been forced to develop alternatives to Chinese financing. In 2024, China's trade volume with partner countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, grew by 6.4% year-on-year, accounting for over half of China's total trade volume for the first time, according to China Digital Times. But this masks the reality that many of these relationships are now transactional rather than strategic. The BRI was supposed to be Xi Jinping's signature achievement, the project that would define his legacy and cement China's status as a global superpower. Instead, it has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the limits of authoritarian development models. The initiative has also revealed the fundamental incompatibility between China's authoritarian governance model and the transparent, accountable development that poor countries actually need. While China can build infrastructure quickly, it struggles with governance reforms and institutional strengthening that make development sustainable. Today, the BRI stands at a crossroads. Chinese Premier Li Qiang recently urged the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to increase support for the initiative, showing China is doubling down rather than stepping back. We do expect Chinese BRI engagement to reach similar levels in 2025 as in 2024, driven by growing needs of China's domestic players to invest abroad. But the world has learned hard lessons. Countries are more cautious, Western alternatives are emerging, and the age of uncritical acceptance of Chinese infrastructure finance is over. The trillion-dollar question now is whether Beijing can learn from these failures, or whether it'll double down on the very approaches that led to this humiliating collapse. What do you think? Can China salvage the Belt and Road Initiative, or is this the beginning of the end for Beijing's global infrastructure dreams? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this deep dive into one of the biggest geopolitical disasters of our time eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're just getting started on exposing the stories that shape our world. The Belt and Road Initiative promised to connect the world. Instead, it revealed the true cost of China's global ambitions, and that cost $1 trillion and counting. China lied about its population. Not by thousands, not by millions, by over 100 million people. That's not a typo. Beijing fabricated enough people to fill a country the size of Japan. And now the truth is collapsing faster than its skyline. At exactly 3:25 p.m. on August 27, 2021, 15 empty skyscrapers in Kunming were leveled in a single demolition. Over 4.6 tons of explosives reduced these ghost towers to rubble, a perfect symbol of China's hollowed-out future. Because this isn't just a housing crisis, or a birth rate slump, or another economic slowdown. This is the total unmasking of a global superpower built on lies. According to the latest data from Statista in 2024, China's birth rate hit an extinction-level low. 6.77 births per 1,000 people. That's fewer babies than funerals. Around 60 to 80 million empty apartments, skyrocketing youth unemployment, a shrinking workforce, an aging population with inadequate pension support. And now 70% of Chinese families have their life savings tied up in properties that are now basically worth less and less every year. Imagine waking up tomorrow and your home is worth almost half of what you paid. Now multiply that nightmare by hundreds of millions of families. For decades, the world feared China's rise. But as you'll soon see, this unstoppable juggernaut was always a mirage, a demographic Ponzi scheme on borrowed time, and the bill is finally coming due. In this video, we'll expose how China fabricated its population numbers to inflate its global power, why its workforce is imploding and taking the economy with it, and what actually happens when a supposed superpower begins rotting from the inside out. The collapse isn't coming, it's already here. Let's begin with the bombshell. China has been cooking its population books for decades. According to Professor Yi Fushan, a leading expert on Chinese demographics, the government has been overestimating its population by at least 10%. Why would they do this? Simple. Bigger population numbers made China look stronger, more productive, and more economically impressive on the world stage. China wanted to project strength, says Yi. Artificially inflated population figures made their GDP per capita look lower, their military power look greater, and their economic miracles seem more miraculous. But the truth is finally breaking through the facade. In 2022, China announced its first population decline in 60 years. But according to Yi's research published in a 2023 study cited by Newsweek, the population actually started shrinking back in 2018, 4 years earlier than officially admitted. The deception wasn't small or accidental. Internal Chinese documents leaked to Western researchers suggest that local officials were pressured to inflate population figures to meet political targets. Birth records were fabricated, deaths went unreported, ghost people populated spreadsheets and databases. Why? Because admitting population decline would mean admitting failure. But the consequences of this lie are now hitting like a tsunami. Production figures that assumed a workforce of a certain size? Wrong. Housing demand projections? Complete fantasy. Economic growth targets? Built on quicksand. The impact has become increasingly hard to ignore. While Beijing continues to project confidence, setting a 2025 GDP growth target of around 5%, most international forecasts paint a more sobering picture, anticipating growth closer to 4 to 4.7%. Long-term projections are even lower, with many analysts expecting China's average growth to dip into the 3% range by the end of the decade. That growing gap between what Beijing promises and what actually happens, it's not just a red flag, it's a siren. More and more experts are calling out the cracks in China's economic fairy tale. But this deception goes far beyond just doctored spreadsheets and faked statistics. And that's where this story becomes a nightmare. Here's something you won't believe. China's birth rate is now lower than Japan's, a country notorious for its demographic crisis. Recent data from Statista shows China recorded just 6.77 births per 1,000 people in 2024, nearly 50% below replacement level. For context, a healthy society needs about 2.1 children per woman just to maintain its population. China isn't even close, and this isn't just a blip. The macro trends data paints a shocking picture. After decades of slowing growth, China's population has now entered negative territory, shrinking by 0.03% in 2024 and continuing to accelerate downward. The annual percentage change graph shows a clear, dramatic decline that demographers project will only worsen. But didn't China end its infamous one-child policy, you might ask? They did in 2016, and absolutely nothing changed. The government expected a baby boom. Instead, they got a baby bust. Young Chinese couples took a hard look at sky-high housing costs, brutal work hours, and expensive education requirements and said, no thanks.
The situation is so dire that the Chinese government has implemented increasingly desperate measures to boost birth rates. In major cities like Shanghai, they've introduced baby bonuses of up to 10,000 won, about $1,400. They've created tax incentives for families with multiple children. They've even launched propaganda campaigns with slogans like "Marriage and reproduction are family responsibilities." None of it is working. As Bloomberg reported in early 2024, China's birth rate continued falling even after couples were allowed to have up to 3 children. But hold on, it gets even worse. According to projections from Visual Capitalist, China's population could shrink by half by 2100, dropping from 1.3 billion to around 600 million. That's losing the entire population of North America in just 75 years. The prestigious Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences put it in even starker terms in their 2023 report. China's demographic collapse is not a future event, but a present reality, moving at an accelerating pace. Think of it this way. China spent decades brutally enforcing a policy to have fewer babies. It worked so well that now, when they desperately need children, they can't convince their population to have them. A Chinese demographer who requested anonymity told the Taipei Times the one-child policy fundamentally altered the cultural understanding of family size. You can't undo that with policy changes. And this is where China's economic house of cards begins to collapse. Here's a fact that should terrify Beijing. China's working-age population peaked back in 2015 and has been shrinking ever since. Let that sink in. For nearly a decade, the engine of China's economic miracle has been losing power. According to research from China Briefing, by 2050, China will have 200 million fewer workers. That's more than the entire U.S. workforce gone. This workforce collapse is already causing severe labor shortages in key industries. Factory owners in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces report having to raise wages by 30 to 40% just to attract basic assembly line workers. That's destroying China's competitive edge as the world's low-cost manufacturer. But that's just the beginning of the nightmare. China is facing a demographic time bomb that no country has ever successfully diffused, getting old before getting rich. Right now, about 14% of China's population is over 65. But by 2040, that number will explode to nearly 30%, almost 1 in 3 people. Imagine a country with more grandparents than workers. The cost of this aging crisis is staggering. According to projections cited by Bloomberg, China faces a looming pension crisis as its rapidly aging population threatens to overwhelm the system within the next decade. Xi Jinping himself acknowledged the severity in a rare moment of candor during a 2023 closed-door meeting with Communist Party officials, reportedly saying, "The demographic situation has become the most significant hidden danger to national security." The social contract that has kept China stable for decades, rapid economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is fracturing under this demographic pressure. Who's going to staff the factories that made China the world's workshop? Who's going to buy all those empty apartments? Who's going to pay for the health care and pensions of hundreds of millions of elderly Chinese? The answer is devastating. Nobody. And this demographic collapse is already causing an economic catastrophe that's becoming impossible to hide. If you've ever wondered what a $5.30 trillion real estate bubble looks like when it pops, just look at China right now. For decades, China built its economy on a simple principle: construct more apartments and people will buy them, not to live in, but as investments. The numbers are mind-blowing. Residential real estate makes up nearly 70% of household wealth in China, compared to just 34% in the United States. When housing prices fall in China, they don't just hurt homeowners, they wipe out entire family fortunes. And falling they are. According to Bloomberg data, Chinese housing prices have dropped for 36 consecutive months as of early 2024. Major developers like Evergrande have collapsed under the weight of more than $300 billion in debt. The domino effect is staggering. Country Garden, once China's largest developer, defaulted on $11 billion in overseas debt in October 2023. Shimao Group, another giant, fell in January 2024. At least 50 major Chinese developers have now defaulted on their debts. These aren't just corporate bankruptcies, they're existential threats to the Chinese middle class. Millions of Chinese families have paid in full for apartments that will never be completed. Their life savings have vanished into concrete foundations that will never support actual homes. The protests have already begun. In over 100 cities across China, home buyers have launched mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay loans on unfinished properties. Social media footage, quickly censored but impossible to completely suppress, shows crowds chanting, "Return our money," outside bank headquarters. And scattered across the country, ghost cities and vacant apartments as far as the eye can see. Entire metropolitan areas built for millions of residents stand virtually empty. The Yuzhapa financial district in Tianjin, once touted as China's answer to Manhattan, remains largely vacant years after construction. According to Newsweek, despite its full skyline of office towers, wide boulevards, and dedicated subway station, it never attracted the residents and businesses it was designed for. Between 60 and 80 million empty apartments stand vacant across China. That's enough housing to accommodate the combined populations of the United Kingdom and Sweden, one apartment for every single citizen of both countries combined, all just sitting empty, collecting dust, and losing value by the day. But here's where things go completely off the rails. Here's a number that should keep you up at night: 300%. That's the approaching debt-to-GDP ratio in China when you combine borrowing by government, households, and corporations, according to the Wall Street Journal. What makes this even more alarming is the massive hidden borrowing by local governments through opaque investment vehicles. On some measures, China's debt burden is now more severe than what the U.S. faced before the 2008 financial crisis, or what Europe experienced during its debt crisis a decade ago. The Chinese economic miracle wasn't built on innovation or productivity. It was built on debt. Mountains of it. Every time growth slowed, the government ordered more construction, more apartments nobody would live in, more infrastructure nobody needed, more factories with no orders, all to keep the GDP numbers up and maintain the illusion of unstoppable economic progress. Former Chinese Finance Minister Liu Jiwei openly acknowledged the problem in a rare, candid speech at Tsinghua University in 2023. Our economic growth has been primarily driven by investment, not by productivity or innovation. This model has reached its limits. And who funded this house of cards? Local governments. These regional authorities across China collectively owe over $9 trillion in debt. For years, they've relied on selling land to developers as their primary source of income. But with the real estate market collapsing, that revenue has dried up completely. Some local government finances are so precarious that they've resorted to bizarre measures to raise cash. The city of Nanning tried to sell police cars. Tianjin auctioned off government furniture. Henan province attempted to force civil servants to buy unsold apartments from struggling developers. The results are catastrophic. According to recent reports from Economic Times, some cities can't pay salaries. Hospitals are running out of supplies. In Henan province, government workers have seen their paychecks cut in half. In others, public servants are being paid in groceries instead of money. Chinese banking expert Michael Pettis from Peking University notes, the debt situation at local levels is far worse than what's officially reported. Many liabilities are kept off the books through local government financing vehicles, which operate as hidden debt mechanisms. The debt problem is so severe that the central government had to take emergency action in January 2024, allowing local governments to swap high-interest debt for lower-interest bonds backed by Beijing. But this just shuffles the problem around. It doesn't solve the fundamental issue that the debt can never be repaid without continued growth that's no longer possible. This isn't some future crisis. It's happening right now. And right alongside this debt catastrophe comes another shocking development that proves how far China's economy has already rotted. China's youth unemployment hit a staggering 21% in 2023, so embarrassing that Beijing simply stopped publishing the numbers, according to Pew Research data. That's just the official figure. According to Business Insider, independent analysts have estimated the real rate could be as high as 46.5% when accounting for underemployment and those who've simply given up looking for work entirely. Think about that. Nearly half of China's young people can't find proper work in what's supposed to be the world's economic powerhouse. The situation became so politically sensitive that in July 2023, China's National Bureau of Statistics simply announced it would suspend reporting youth unemployment figures while it improved its methodology. Translation: the numbers were too damning to share publicly. College graduates are calling themselves full-time children, moving back in with the parents after failing to find jobs. Others talk about lying flat, giving up on career ambitions entirely in a system that seems rigged against them. A 25-year-old from Shanghai told CNN, "I spent 4 years getting an engineering degree. Now I deliver food on an electric scooter. My parents spent their life savings on my education for nothing." These aren't just statistics. They're tens of millions of educated, ambitious young people with nothing to do and no hope for the future. Throughout history, that's been the most explosive social combination possible. The desperation is fueling a new social phenomenon in China: involution, a culture of fierce, pointless competition for dwindling opportunities. Young Chinese describe spending 16-hour days studying for civil service exams, where 1.5 million applicants compete for just 37,000 government jobs. The odds of success? About 2%. Meanwhile, the factories that once provided endless jobs are shutting down or moving elsewhere. Apple is aggressively shifting iPhone production to India. Nike and Adidas have relocated much of their manufacturing to Vietnam. But these corporate moves are just the beginning of a much larger economic divorce. According to World Trade Organization forecasts, Chinese exports to the United States are expected to collapse by a staggering 77% in 2025, an unprecedented disruption to global trade patterns that will reverberate through both economies. The days of China as the world's factory are ending, says economist Damien Ma of the Paulson Institute. It's a structural shift accelerated by geopolitical tensions but fundamentally driven by China's own demographic and economic challenges. And as manufacturing flees, it reveals an even darker truth beneath the surface. What's truly terrifying about China's economic rot is that it's not just about money and jobs. The country is literally running out of the most fundamental resource of all. 90% of China's groundwater is polluted, according to environmental data from Our World Data. The Yellow River, which supports 160 million people, now runs dry for months each year. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces water shortages so severe that experts question whether the region will remain habitable. China's water crisis is the most severe and complex in human history, says Dr. Zhang Jinfeng of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The scale of the problem affects hundreds of millions of people and threatens the foundation of our industrial capacity. The statistics are apocalyptic. More than 400 Chinese cities suffer from permanent water shortages. Over 700 million people drink water contaminated with human or animal waste. In Beijing, the water table has dropped nearly 1,000 feet since the 1970s. The government's solution? The South to North Water Diversion Project, the largest water diversion project in world history, costing over $62 billion. But even this mega project can only address about 5% of northern China's water deficit. Without water, China's farms and factories will grind to a halt. Cities will become unlivable. No amount of economic policy or government intervention can create water where there is none. And let's not forget, this is a country that can't even feed itself. Despite having 20% of the world's population, China has just 7% of its arable land and imports 80% of its soybeans and huge quantities of other foods. A startling fact, China has less farmland per capita than Saudi Arabia. Think about that. A desert kingdom has 37.5% more arable land per person than the supposed agricultural powerhouse of Asia. The fragility of China's food supply was demonstrated dramatically during COVID lockdowns when residents of Shanghai, China's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan city, faced food shortages so severe that people were bartering luxury goods for basic groceries. A nation with a shrinking population, polluted water, dependence on imported food,
And an economy built on lies is a nation on the brink of collapse. But what happens in China won't stay in China. You might be thinking, why should I care about China's problems? Because when the world's second largest economy and the manufacturing hub for everything from iPhones to antibiotics starts unraveling, the shockwaves will hit every corner of the globe. Global supply chains will collapse, price inflation will spike, financial markets will crash as Chinese investors pull out to cover domestic losses. China's economic problems represent the single largest threat to global economic stability today, warns former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. The interconnections between China's economy and the rest of the world run deeper than most people realize. Consider this: China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It controls 85% of global rare earth processing, critical for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. It manufactures 80% of the world's solar panels and 76% of its lithium-ion batteries. If China's economy crashes, the cascade effects would be unprecedented. Commodities markets would collapse overnight as Chinese demand evaporates. Australia's mining industry, Brazil's agricultural exports, and Germany's luxury car sales would all suffer devastating blows. Even more concerning is what happens to the $784 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds held by China. If Chinese authorities needed to liquidate these holdings to manage domestic economic crises, American borrowing costs could spike overnight. But that's not even the most dangerous part of this unfolding disaster. What keeps military strategists up at night is Beijing's need for distraction. As China's internal problems mount, its external aggression has reached alarming levels. Military analysts have documented increasing naval activity in the South China Sea and a significant rise in military flights into Taiwan's air defense zone. The rhetoric from top officials has shifted from talk of peaceful reunification to increasingly aggressive posturing. It's the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. When the economy collapses, find an enemy to blame. When citizens start questioning their government, give them a foreign threat to fear instead. But here's what's truly terrifying. History shows that when authoritarian regimes face internal crises, they often look for external enemies to blame. China's increasing military aggression, territorial claims, and threats against Taiwan aren't happening in a vacuum. They're the desperate actions of a regime that knows its economic miracle is turning into a nightmare. There's a direct correlation between China's internal economic stress and its external belligerence, explains Dr. Elizabeth Economy of the Hoover Institution. The more pressure the Communist Party faces at home, the more it needs a foreign adversary to distract its population. And unlike previous global powers in decline, China has nuclear weapons, the world's largest military force with 2.035 million active personnel and a leadership structure that fears losing control more than anything else. The truth about China's population lie isn't just reshaping one country, it's rewriting the future of the entire world. The truth is undeniable. The China we've been told to fear was built on deception, not just propaganda aimed at the outside world, but a fundamental misrepresentation of its own economic and demographic reality. What we're witnessing is not just another downturn in a business cycle, it's the unraveling of the greatest economic mirage in modern history. Former Chinese Premier Li Keqiang inadvertently revealed this in a private conversation leaked to foreign diplomats, saying China's official GDP statistics were man-made and for reference only. He personally relied on electricity consumption, rail cargo volume, and bank lending as more reliable indicators of China's true economic condition. By those measures, China's economy is already in deep trouble. The reality is that China's economic miracle ended years ago, says Dr. Michael Beckley of Tufts University. What we're seeing now is the lag between economic reality and global perception. China isn't rising. It's already rotting from within. Empty apartments worth trillions sitting vacant. Ghost cities built for millions with no residents. A workforce that's been shrinking for nearly a decade. Local governments so broke they're paying workers with groceries instead of money. The social instability this creates is Beijing's worst nightmare. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests almost entirely on delivering economic prosperity. When that vanishes, what's left? Xi Jinping seems to know the answer, which explains China's massive investment in surveillance and security technology. The regime now spends more on internal security than on its military, a telling statistic about what truly frightens Chinese leadership. This isn't some distant future threat. The collapse is happening right now, in real time, and the consequences will reshape our world. So what do you think? Is China's decline inevitable, or can Beijing somehow turn things around? And how will the truth about China's population lie affect global markets and security in the next decade? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out 17 facts about China's collapse that seem fake but are 100% real. Or click this other video instead. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos that expose the shocking realities behind today's biggest global stories. Thanks for watching. They built an empire of lies, and now it's all falling apart. 20 years ago, China promised the world it would become the next great superpower. Massive GDP growth, gleaming megacities, technological dominance, the works. But here's what they didn't tell you. It was all fake. The growth numbers? Manipulated. The cities? Ghost towns. The economic miracle? Built on a mountain of debt that's about to bury them alive. Empire of lies, that's what China really built, and we're about to expose every single deception. Right now, as you watch this, China's youth unemployment is so bad they stopped publishing the real numbers. Their property market, worth more than the entire U.S. economy, is imploding. Major cities are going bankrupt, and the government is so desperate they're literally buying empty apartments just to hide the crisis. This isn't just China's problem. When an $18.7 trillion economy built on lies starts collapsing, everyone feels it. You think you know the story of China's rise? You don't know anything yet. What we're about to show you will completely change how you see the world's supposed next superpower. The empire of lies is crumbling, and the truth is more shocking than anyone imagined. Let's start with the biggest lie of all, China's economic growth. Beijing claims they hit exactly 5% GDP growth in 2024. Exactly 5%. What are the odds of hitting a round number like that in a real economy? Zero. The Rhodium Group estimates the real growth was around 2.4 to 2.8%. China had to lie about nearly half their economic performance just to look respectable. Here's the smoking gun. While reporting this strong growth, China was simultaneously cutting interest rates, launching emergency stimulus, and creating new ways to prop up their stock market. Even China doesn't believe their own numbers. And that 2.4% to 2.8% growth came at a staggering cost. China had to invest 40% of their entire economy to achieve it. The U.S. invests about 20%. China burns $40 to generate $100 of activity. That's not growth. That's economic arson. China's nominal GDP, the number that actually matters for real wages and government budgets, grew by only 4.2% in 2024. That's the slowest rate on record outside of the pandemic years. When your nominal growth is slower than your real growth, you've got serious problems. China's GDP deflator turned negative in 2024, and producer prices stayed in deflation, while headline inflation was barely plus 0.2%. The manufacturing sector tells an even uglier story. Remember when China was the world's factory floor? Those days are ending fast. In 2023 alone, foreign companies announced 378 major factory relocations out of China. Apple moved iPhone production to India. Samsung fled to Vietnam. Even Chinese companies like BYD are building factories in Mexico and Thailand. Why? Because Chinese workers aren't cheap anymore. Factory wages have tripled in the last decade. A worker in Vietnam costs half as much as one in China. In India, it's even less. But here's the kicker. China's workforce is shrinking. They've lost more than 41 million working-age people since 2020, and it's getting worse every year. But here's what reveals just how deep the deception goes. Those high-tech industries China keeps bragging about, they're tiny compared to their overall economy. Despite all the hype about becoming a tech superpower, high-tech manufacturing represents about 15% of industrial output. Meanwhile, traditional heavy industries are massively overbuilt and losing money. China's solution?
dump excess production on global markets at below-cost prices. That's not sustainable growth. That's economic warfare, and it's why countries are slapping tariffs on Chinese goods. The empire of lies convinced the world that China's rise was inevitable. But when your economy only grows through massive debt, when your workforce is aging out, and when factories are fleeing to cheaper countries, that's not a superpower in the making. That's a bubble about to burst. And speaking of bubbles, wait until you see what's happening to China's population, because the demographic disaster unfolding right now makes their economic lies look like small change. Here's a number that should terrify Beijing. China lost 1.39 million people in 2024. That's the third straight year of population decline. But the real horror story is in the details. China's birth rate has collapsed to just 1.0 children per woman in 2024. To put that in perspective, you need 2.1 children per woman just to maintain a stable population. China isn't even close. They're not just below replacement level, they're in demographic freefall. And it's accelerating. Marriages have plunged dramatically over the last decade. When people aren't getting married, they're not having kids. When they're not having kids, your entire civilization starts to die. The numbers are staggering. By 2035, just 10 years from now, 1 in 3 Chinese people will be over 60. That's more than 400 million elderly people who need pensions, healthcare, and support. For comparison, that's more senior citizens than the entire population of the United States. But here's where the empire of lies really crumbles. Who's going to support all these elderly people? China's typical family structure looks like this: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. They call them 4-2-1 families. That 1 child is supposed to support 6 older people. It's mathematically impossible. The working age population has already peaked and is now shrinking by 3 million people every year. By 2050, China will have twice as many people outside the working age as inside it. And the young people who are supposed to be China's future, they're giving up. Youth unemployment is so bad that China literally stopped publishing the numbers. When they resumed with the new methodology in December 2023, they somehow claimed unemployment had magically dropped from over 21% to under 15%. Right. What they actually did was change the definition to exclude students, rural, unemployed, and people who'd given up looking for work. Independent estimates put real youth unemployment closer to 30%. That's 1 in 3 young Chinese people without work. Meet the lying flat generation. Young Chinese who've completely opted out of the rat race. They refuse to work overtime, refuse to buy homes, refuse to get married, refuse to have children. Some are literally retiring to rural areas to escape the economic pressure. It's a massive rejection of everything the Chinese system promised them, and it's spreading. The number of Chinese applying to emigrate hit record highs in 2024. The wealthy are sending their kids abroad and moving their money with them. China isn't just losing people, it's losing its best and brightest. Here's the brutal truth: demographics is destiny, and China's destiny is to grow old before it grows rich. But there's an even more sinister aspect to China's demographic lies: the gender imbalance. Thanks to the one-child policy and cultural preferences for male children, China now has 30 million more men than women. They call them bare branches, men with no hope of continuing their family line. And they're angry. China tried to fix the birth rate with cash incentives. Some provinces pay up to $1,400 per child. They've made fertility treatments free. None of it is working. Here's why. Nearly 36,000 kindergartens closed in just 2 years. Elementary schools are shutting down by the thousands. When young people can barely afford to support themselves, having children becomes impossible. The empire built on lies told its people that prosperity was guaranteed. But when your birth rate collapses, your workforce shrinks, and your young people give up on the future, that's not the foundation of a superpower. That's the foundation of a civilization in decline. But you haven't seen the worst part yet, because what's happening to China's property market isn't just an economic crisis, it's the complete destruction of middle-class wealth on a scale that has never been seen before. China's real estate market is worth $50 trillion, more than the entire U.S. economy, and it's all coming down. They built enough empty apartments to house multiple times China's population. Surveys estimate around 65 million vacant units. That's 21% of all homes in China. For perspective, the entire U.S. has 140 million housing units total. Chinese families have 70% of their wealth tied up in real estate. When property values collapse, they lose everything. And collapse they have. Prices drop 30% in some cities. Remember Evergrande? Defaulted on $300 billion. Country Garden? $187 billion. Together, Chinese developers owe more than France's entire GDP. Here's the evil part. Developers sold 20 million apartments before building them, using new buyer money to finish old projects. Now, construction has stopped forever on millions of pre-sold homes. Take Zhang Wei from Shenzhen. In 2020, he spent $400,000 on an apartment. Today, it's worth half that. His life savings gone. Local governments funded themselves by selling land to developers. With property frozen, cities are cutting salaries 50%. Some can't afford streetlights. Tianjin is literally selling government buildings. They can't afford their own offices. The smoking gun? Local governments have $9 trillion in hidden debt through special financing vehicles. That's bigger than Japan and Germany's economies combined. These vehicles are now defaulting. Instead of fixing the crisis, China's doubling down on deception. State companies are buying empty apartments to hide oversupply. They're arresting economists who publish negative data. When your solution to bad news is jailing messengers, you're not running an economy, you're running a cult. But there's an even darker layer to this crisis. The mortgage boycott movement we just mentioned. What started as isolated protests became a nationwide rebellion against the property system. Banks are now sitting on trillions in bad loans they can't acknowledge without triggering a financial meltdown. Some estimates suggest up to 40% of bank assets are tied to real estate in some form. When the property market dies, the banking system dies with it. Regional banks are already quietly failing. Small banks in Tier 3 cities have stopped making new loans entirely. The government response? Merge failing banks with healthier ones and hope nobody notices. Remember those ghost cities we mentioned? They're not just empty, they're actively deteriorating. Buildings constructed with substandard materials are literally crumbling before anyone ever lived in them. China built a $1 trillion mirage that's now turning to dust. And remember, this was supposed to be the foundation of China's middle class, the pathway to prosperity, the proof that the Chinese system worked. Instead, it's revealed as the biggest wealth destruction event in modern history. The empire of lies promised its people that real estate was a guaranteed path to riches. But when you build an entire economy on empty apartments and fabricated demand, the only guarantee is collapse. But if you think the property crisis is bad, wait until you see what's happening to China's social fabric. Because a generation of young Chinese isn't just losing money, they're losing hope. China had a deal with its people. Give up political freedom, get economic prosperity. For 40 years, it worked. Now that social contract is crumbling. The jobless generation we mentioned, they're not just unemployed, they're completely checking out. Marriage rates plunged 60% in the last decade. Consumer spending has stagnated. Young people aren't just worried about the future, they're giving up on it. The brain drain is accelerating. Immigration applications hit record highs in 2024. The wealthy are fleeing with their money. China is losing human capital it can't replace. Xi Jinping's response? Double down on control. More surveillance, more censorship, more nationalism. He's trying to replace the economic dream with the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But you can't eat nationalism. The regime is so desperate they're censoring economists who tell inconvenient truths. This isn't confident superpower behavior. This is a government that knows its foundational promises are exposed as lies. And that brings us to perhaps the biggest lie of all, China's supposed military strength and global influence. But before we expose China's military mirage, we need to talk about the man who accelerated China's decline, Xi Jinping. Remember how China used to work? Local officials had freedom to experiment, foreign investors were welcome, private business thrived. This system wasn't perfect, but it turned China into an economic powerhouse. Xi changed everything. Since taking power in 2012, he's rewired China's entire economy around one principle: his personal control. Take Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba.
One speech criticizing financial regulators got his company's IPO canceled, triggered investigations, and made him disappear for months. Alibaba lost $400 billion in value because one businessman spoke out of turn. But Jack Ma wasn't the only casualty. Tech entrepreneur and actress Zhao Wei, once worth billions, saw her empire dismantled overnight after regulators decided she had too much influence. Real estate mogul Wang Jinlin was forced to sell off overseas assets and retreat from global expansion. The message was clear: no one gets bigger than Xi. Xi's anti-espionage law made basic market research potentially criminal. On a balance of payments basis, net foreign direct investment crashed 82% in 2023 to just $33 billion, the lowest since 1993. Businesses would rather abandon the world's biggest market than deal with this paranoia. Here's the devastating irony. Xi claimed these crackdowns would make China stronger by reducing chaos and disorder. Instead, they've killed the entrepreneurial spirit that made China's rise possible. Silicon Valley executives who once flocked to Beijing now avoid China entirely. Global companies are de-risking their supply chains to reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing. Even Chinese entrepreneurs are moving their operations overseas. Local officials are now so terrified of making mistakes that they won't make decisions at all. When fear replaces expertise, you don't get growth, you get systemic destruction. Xi Jinping promised to make China great again. Instead, he's become the chief architect of China's decline, the man who killed the Chinese dream with his own hands. The leader who promised to make China great again has become the gravedigger of China's superpower dreams. China wants the world to believe it's a military superpower ready to challenge American dominance. But strip away the propaganda and you'll find another layer of the empire of lies. Yes, China has the world's largest military by personnel. Yes, they've been modernizing rapidly. But here's what they don't want you to know. Their military faces the same demographic crisis as the rest of the country. China's military is aging out. The one-child policy means fewer young men available for service. And those who are available, many are the same lying flat generation who have given up on everything else. But the real weakness isn't in personnel, it's in experience. China's last major military conflict was with Vietnam in 1979. Their military leaders have no experience managing large-scale modern warfare. Compare that to the United States, which has been conducting complex military operations continuously for decades. More revealing is what's happening to China's defense spending. Despite claims of military modernization, much of their defense budget goes to internal security, controlling their own population rather than projecting power globally. China's military buildup looks impressive on paper, but when your biggest security threat is your own citizens giving up on the system, that's not the foundation of global military power. Here's what we know for certain. China's Belt and Road Initiative, their supposed vehicle for global influence, is collapsing. Sri Lanka, under debt stress, leased its strategic Hambantota port to a Chinese state-owned firm for 99 years. Pakistan is struggling with Chinese debt payments. Instead of building influence, China has created a portfolio of bad debt around the world. The empire of lies thought it could buy global dominance through infrastructure loans. But when you're lending money you don't have to countries that can't pay it back, you're not building an empire, you're creating a house of cards. And now that house of cards is falling down. China's response? Doubled down on aggression. More threats against Taiwan, more confrontations in the South China Sea, more economic coercion against countries that displease it. This is how declining powers behave, not rising superpowers. But here's why this matters to everyone watching. When the world's second largest economy starts collapsing, the ripple effects are global. The global supply chains that seem so stable, they're being rewired around China's decline. The trade relationships that powered decades of growth, they're fracturing as countries realize they can't depend on an economy built on lies. And as China becomes more desperate, it becomes more dangerous. Economic collapse doesn't make authoritarian regimes moderate, it makes them radical. The economic foundation that was supposed to support China's rise to global superpower status simply isn't there anymore. You can't project power globally when your domestic economy is contracting, your population is aging, and your young people are opting out. The empire of lies is discovering that you can't lie your way to global dominance. Real power requires real economic strength, real demographic vitality, and real social cohesion. China has none of these things. But there's one final layer to China's empire of lies that almost nobody understands: the debt crisis that makes everything else look manageable. China's total debt exceeds 300% of GDP, higher than Japan at its bubble peak. Local governments owe $9 trillion in hidden debt alone. This creates a mathematical impossibility: debt growing faster than the economy. The only outcomes? Default or hyperinflation. Beijing knows this. That's why they're desperately manipulating statistics and forcing state companies to buy those empty apartments we talked about. The empire built on lies has painted itself into a corner. Here's the terrifying part: China's debt crisis isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's already causing real-world chaos in multiple provinces. Local government employees haven't been paid in months in some areas. Infrastructure projects are being abandoned mid-construction. Some cities can't afford basic services. The central government keeps promising bailouts, but they're running out of money too. Reports indicate China's foreign reserves face pressure as capital flees the country. They're selling U.S. Treasury bonds to fund domestic spending, clear sign of desperation. International lenders are starting to notice. Rating agencies have adjusted China's outlook, and foreign banks are restricting lending to Chinese entities. The world is slowly realizing that China's promises might not be as solid as they once appeared. When China's debt bomb explodes, it won't just destroy China, it will trigger the biggest economic reshuffling since World War II. Global supply chains will snap, trade relationships will fracture, and the world will finally see what happens when a $17 trillion economy built on deception comes crashing down. So where does that leave us? China's superpower dream was always built on quicksand. The impressive growth numbers were manipulated. The gleaming cities were largely empty. The demographic dividend has turned into a demographic disaster, and the property market that created middle-class wealth has destroyed it instead. This isn't just an economic crisis or a demographic problem. This is the systematic unraveling of an empire that was never as powerful as it appeared. The lies are catching up with reality, and reality is harsh. But here's what makes this collapse different from other economic disasters. China built its entire national identity around inevitable rise. They convinced not just the world, but themselves, that their dominance was destiny. When that narrative crumbles, it doesn't just hurt economically. It creates an existential crisis for the entire civilization. What is China if not the rising superpower? What is the Communist Party's legitimacy if not delivering prosperity? These are questions Beijing can't answer without admitting the empire of lies was exactly that: lies. China will likely remain a major economy, but the idea that they were destined to surpass America and dominate the 21st century, that was always a fantasy built on fabricated data, unsustainable debt, and demographic impossibilities. The most shocking part? We're watching this collapse happen in real time. While most of the world still believes in China's inevitable rise, the foundation has already cracked beyond repair. The empire of lies is crumbling from within, and no amount of propaganda can hold back economic gravity forever. What do you think? Are we witnessing the end of China's superpower ambitions, or is this just a temporary setback? And what does this mean for the global balance of power in the coming decades? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the forces reshaping our world. Hit that notification bell because the story of China's empire of lies is far from over. China lied about its population, not by thousands, not by millions, by over 100 million people. That's not a typo. Beijing fabricated enough people to fill a country the size of Japan. And now the truth is collapsing faster than its skyline. At exactly 3:25 p.m. on August 27, 2021, 15 empty skyscrapers in Kunming were leveled in a single demolition. Over 4.6 tons of explosives reduced these ghost towers to rubble, a perfect symbol of China's hollowed-out future. Because this isn't just a housing crisis, or a birth rate slump, or another economic slowdown. This is the total unmasking of a global superpower built on lies. According to the latest data from Statista in 2024, China's birth rate hit an extinction-level low, 6.77 births per 1,000 people. That's fewer babies than funerals, around 60 to 80 million empty apartments, skyrocketing youth unemployment, a shrinking workforce, an aging population with inadequate pension support. And now 70% of Chinese families have their life savings tied up in properties that are now basically worth less and less every year. Imagine waking up tomorrow and your home is worth almost half of what you paid. Now multiply that nightmare by hundreds of millions of families. For decades, the world feared China's rise. But as you'll soon see, this unstoppable juggernaut was always a mirage, a demographic Ponzi scheme on borrowed time, and the bill is finally coming due. In this video, we'll expose how China fabricated its population numbers to inflate its global power, why its workforce is imploding and taking the economy with it, and what actually happens when a supposed superpower begins rotting from the inside out. The collapse isn't coming, it's already here. Let's begin with the bombshell. China has been cooking its population books for decades. According to Professor Yi Fushan, a leading expert on Chinese demographics, the government has been overestimating its population by at least 10%. Why would they do this? Simple. Bigger population numbers made China look stronger, more productive, and more economically impressive on the world stage. China wanted to project strength, says Yi. Artificially inflated population figures made their GDP per capita look lower, their military power look greater, and their economic miracles seem more miraculous. But the truth is finally breaking through the facade. In 2022, China announced its first population decline in 60 years. But according to Yi's research published in a 2023 study cited by Newsweek, the population actually started shrinking back in 2018, 4 years earlier than officially admitted. The deception wasn't small or accidental. Internal Chinese documents leaked to Western researchers suggest that local officials were pressured to inflate population figures to meet political targets. Birth records were fabricated, deaths went unreported, ghost people populated spreadsheets and databases. Why? Because admitting population decline would mean admitting failure. But the consequences of this lie are now hitting like a tsunami. Production figures that assumed a workforce of a certain size? Wrong. Housing demand projections? Complete fantasy. Economic growth targets? Built on quicksand. The impact has become increasingly hard to ignore. While Beijing continues to project confidence, setting a 2025 GDP growth target of around 5%, most international forecasts paint a more sobering picture, anticipating growth closer to 4 to 4.7%. Long-term projections are even lower, with many analysts expecting China's average growth to dip into the 3% range by the end of the decade. That growing gap between what Beijing promises and what actually happens, it's not just a red flag, it's a siren. More and more experts are calling out the cracks in China's economic fairy tale. But this deception goes far beyond just doctored spreadsheets and faked statistics. And that's where this story becomes a nightmare. Here's something you won't believe. China's birth rate is now lower than Japan's, a country notorious for its demographic crisis. Recent data from Statista shows China recorded just 6.77 births per 1,000 people in 2024, nearly 50% below replacement level. For context, a healthy society needs about 2.1 children per woman just to maintain its population. China isn't even close, and this isn't just a blip. The macro trends data paints a shocking picture. After decades of slowing growth, China's population has now entered negative territory, shrinking by 0.03% in 2024 and continuing to accelerate downward. The annual percentage change graph shows a clear, dramatic decline that demographers project will only worsen. But didn't China end its infamous one-child policy, you might ask? They did in 2016, and absolutely nothing changed. The government expected a baby boom. Instead, they got a baby bust. Young Chinese couples took a hard look at sky-high housing costs, brutal work hours, and expensive education requirements and said, no thanks.
The situation is so dire that the Chinese government has implemented increasingly desperate measures to boost birth rates. In major cities like Shanghai, they've introduced baby bonuses of up to 10,000 won, about $1,400. They've created tax incentives for families with multiple children. They've even launched propaganda campaigns with slogans like "Marriage and reproduction are family responsibilities." None of it is working. As Bloomberg reported in early 2024, China's birth rate continued falling even after couples were allowed to have up to 3 children. But hold on, it gets even worse. According to projections from Visual Capitalist, China's population could shrink by half by 2100, dropping from 1.3 billion to around 600 million. That's losing the entire population of North America in just 75 years. The prestigious Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences put it in even starker terms in their 2023 report. China's demographic collapse is not a future event, but a present reality, moving at an accelerating pace. Think of it this way. China spent decades brutally enforcing a policy to have fewer babies. It worked so well that now, when they desperately need children, they can't convince their population to have them. A Chinese demographer who requested anonymity told the Taipei Times the one-child policy fundamentally altered the cultural understanding of family size. You can't undo that with policy changes. And this is where China's economic house of cards begins to collapse. Here's a fact that should terrify Beijing. China's working-age population peaked back in 2015 and has been shrinking ever since. Let that sink in. For nearly a decade, the engine of China's economic miracle has been losing power. According to research from China Briefing, by 2050, China will have 200 million fewer workers. That's more than the entire U.S. workforce gone. This workforce collapse is already causing severe labor shortages in key industries. Factory owners in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces report having to raise wages by 30 to 40% just to attract basic assembly line workers. That's destroying China's competitive edge as the world's low-cost manufacturer. But that's just the beginning of the nightmare. China is facing a demographic time bomb that no country has ever successfully diffused, getting old before getting rich. Right now, about 14% of China's population is over 65. But by 2040, that number will explode to nearly 30%, almost 1 in 3 people. Imagine a country with more grandparents than workers. The cost of this aging crisis is staggering. According to projections cited by Bloomberg, China faces a looming pension crisis as its rapidly aging population threatens to overwhelm the system within the next decade. Xi Jinping himself acknowledged the severity in a rare moment of candor during a 2023 closed-door meeting with Communist Party officials, reportedly saying, "The demographic situation has become the most significant hidden danger to national security." The social contract that has kept China stable for decades, rapid economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is fracturing under this demographic pressure. Who's going to staff the factories that made China the world's workshop? Who's going to buy all those empty apartments? Who's going to pay for the health care and pensions of hundreds of millions of elderly Chinese? The answer is devastating. Nobody. And this demographic collapse is already causing an economic catastrophe that's becoming impossible to hide. If you've ever wondered what a $5.30 trillion real estate bubble looks like when it pops, just look at China right now. For decades, China built its economy on a simple principle: construct more apartments and people will buy them, not to live in, but as investments. The numbers are mind-blowing. Residential real estate makes up nearly 70% of household wealth in China, compared to just 34% in the United States. When housing prices fall in China, they don't just hurt homeowners, they wipe out entire family fortunes. And falling they are. According to Bloomberg data, Chinese housing prices have dropped for 36 consecutive months as of early 2024. Major developers like Evergrande have collapsed under the weight of more than $300 billion in debt. The domino effect is staggering. Country Garden, once China's largest developer, defaulted on $11 billion in overseas debt in October 2023. Shimao Group, another giant, fell in January 2024. At least 50 major Chinese developers have now defaulted on their debts. These aren't just corporate bankruptcies, they're existential threats to the Chinese middle class. Millions of Chinese families have paid in full for apartments that will never be completed. Their life savings have vanished into concrete foundations that will never support actual homes. The protests have already begun. In over 100 cities across China, homebuyers have launched mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay loans on unfinished properties. Social media footage, quickly censored but impossible to completely suppress, shows crowds chanting, "Return our money," outside bank headquarters. And scattered across the country, ghost cities and vacant apartments as far as the eye can see. Entire metropolitan areas built for millions of residents stand virtually empty. The Yuzhapa financial district in Tianjin, once touted as China's answer to Manhattan, remains largely vacant years after construction. According to Newsweek, despite its full skyline of office towers, wide boulevards, and dedicated subway station, it never attracted the residents and businesses it was designed for. Between 60 and 80 million empty apartments stand vacant across China. That's enough housing to accommodate the combined populations of the United Kingdom and Sweden. One apartment for every single citizen of both countries combined, all just sitting empty, collecting dust and losing value by the day. But here's where things go completely off the rails. Here's a number that should keep you up at night: 300%. That's the approaching debt-to-GDP ratio in China when you combine borrowing by government, households, and corporations, according to the Wall Street Journal. What makes this even more alarming is the massive hidden borrowing by local governments through opaque investment vehicles. On some measures, China's debt burden is now more severe than what the U.S. faced before the 2008 financial crisis, or what Europe experienced during its debt crisis a decade ago. The Chinese economic miracle wasn't built on innovation or productivity. It was built on debt. Mountains of it. Every time growth slowed, the government ordered more construction, more apartments nobody would live in, more infrastructure nobody needed, more factories with no orders, all to keep the GDP numbers up and maintain the illusion of unstoppable economic progress. Former Chinese Finance Minister Liu Jiwei openly acknowledged the problem in a rare, candid speech at Tsinghua University in 2023. Our economic growth has been primarily driven by investment, not by productivity or innovation. This model has reached its limits. And who funded this house of cards? Local governments. These regional authorities across China collectively owe over $9 trillion in debt. For years, they've relied on selling land to developers as their primary source of income. But with the real estate market collapsing, that revenue has dried up completely. Some local government finances are so precarious that they've resorted to bizarre measures to raise cash. The city of Nanning tried to sell police cars. Tianjin auctioned off government furniture. Henan province attempted to force civil servants to buy unsold apartments from struggling developers. The results are catastrophic. According to recent reports from Economic Times, some cities can't pay salaries. Hospitals are running out of supplies. In Henan province, government workers have seen their paychecks cut in half. In others, public servants are being paid in groceries instead of money. Chinese banking expert Michael Pettis from Peking University notes, the debt situation at local levels is far worse than what's officially reported. Many liabilities are kept off the books through local government financing vehicles, which operate as hidden debt mechanisms. The debt problem is so severe that the central government had to take emergency action in January 2024, allowing local governments to swap high-interest debt for lower-interest bonds backed by Beijing. But this just shuffles the problem around. It doesn't solve the fundamental issue that the debt can never be repaid without continued growth that's no longer possible. This isn't some future crisis. It's happening right now. And right alongside this debt catastrophe comes another shocking development that proves how far China's economy has already rotted. China's youth unemployment hit a staggering 21% in 2023, so embarrassing that Beijing simply stopped publishing the numbers, according to Pew Research data. That's just the official figure. According to Business Insider, independent analysts have estimated the real rate could be as high as 46.5% when accounting for underemployment and those who've simply given up looking for work entirely. Think about that. Nearly half of China's young people can't find proper work in what's supposed to be the world's economic powerhouse. The situation became so politically sensitive that in July 2023, China's National Bureau of Statistics simply announced it would suspend reporting youth unemployment figures while it improved its methodology. Translation: the numbers were too damning to share publicly. College graduates are calling themselves full-time children, moving back in with the parents after failing to find jobs. Others talk about lying flat, giving up on career ambitions entirely in a system that seems rigged against them. A 25-year-old from Shanghai told CNN, "I spent 4 years getting an engineering degree. Now I deliver food on an electric scooter. My parents spent their life savings on my education for nothing." These aren't just statistics. They're tens of millions of educated, ambitious young people with nothing to do and no hope for the future. Throughout history, that's been the most explosive social combination possible. The desperation is fueling a new social phenomenon in China: involution, a culture of fierce, pointless competition for dwindling opportunities. Young Chinese describe spending 16-hour days studying for civil service exams, where 1.5 million applicants compete for just 37,000 government jobs. The odds of success? About 2%. Meanwhile, the factories that once provided endless jobs are shutting down or moving elsewhere. Apple is aggressively shifting iPhone production to India. Nike and Adidas have relocated much of their manufacturing to Vietnam. But these corporate moves are just the beginning of a much larger economic divorce. According to World Trade Organization forecasts, Chinese exports to the United States are expected to collapse by a staggering 77% in 2025, an unprecedented disruption to global trade patterns that will reverberate through both economies. The days of China as the world's factory are ending, says economist Damien Ma of the Paulson Institute. It's a structural shift accelerated by geopolitical tensions but fundamentally driven by China's own demographic and economic challenges. And as manufacturing flees, it reveals an even darker truth beneath the surface. What's truly terrifying about China's economic rot is that it's not just about money and jobs. The country is literally running out of the most fundamental resource of all. 90% of China's groundwater is polluted, according to environmental data from Our World Data. The Yellow River, which supports 160 million people, now runs dry for months each year. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces water shortages so severe that experts question whether the region will remain habitable. China's water crisis is the most severe and complex in human history, says Dr. Zhang Jinfeng of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The scale of the problem affects hundreds of millions of people and threatens the foundation of our industrial capacity. The statistics are apocalyptic. More than 400 Chinese cities suffer from permanent water shortages. Over 700 million people drink water contaminated with human or animal waste. In Beijing, the water table has dropped nearly 1,000 feet since the 1970s. The government's solution? The South to North Water Diversion Project, the largest water diversion project in world history, costing over $62 billion. But even this mega project can only address about 5% of northern China's water deficit. Without water, China's farms and factories will grind to a halt. Cities will become unlivable. No amount of economic policy or government intervention can create water where there is none. And let's not forget, this is a country that can't even feed itself. Despite having 20% of the world's population, China has just 7% of its arable land and imports 80% of its soybeans and huge quantities of other foods. A startling fact, China has less farmland per capita than Saudi Arabia. Think about that. A desert kingdom has 37.5% more arable land per person than the supposed agricultural powerhouse of Asia. The fragility of China's food supply was demonstrated dramatically during COVID lockdowns when residents of Shanghai, China's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan city, faced food shortages so severe that people were bartering luxury goods for basic groceries. A nation with a shrinking population, polluted water, dependence on imported food,
and an economy built on lies is a nation on the brink of collapse. But what happens in China won't stay in China. You might be thinking, why should I care about China's problems? Because when the world's second largest economy and the manufacturing hub for everything from iPhones to antibiotics starts unraveling, the shockwaves will hit every corner of the globe. Global supply chains will collapse, price inflation will spike, financial markets will crash as Chinese investors pull out to cover domestic losses. China's economic problems represent the single largest threat to global economic stability today, warns former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. The interconnections between China's economy and the rest of the world run deeper than most people realize. Consider this: China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It controls 85% of global rare earth processing, critical for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. It manufactures 80% of the world's solar panels and 76% of its lithium-ion batteries. If China's economy crashes, the cascade effects would be unprecedented. Commodities markets would collapse overnight as Chinese demand evaporates. Australia's mining industry, Brazil's agricultural exports, and Germany's luxury car sales would all suffer devastating blows. Even more concerning is what happens to the $784 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds held by China. If Chinese authorities needed to liquidate these holdings to manage domestic economic crises, American borrowing costs could spike overnight. But that's not even the most dangerous part of this unfolding disaster. What keeps military strategists up at night is Beijing's need for distraction. As China's internal problems mount, its external aggression has reached alarming levels. Military analysts have documented increasing naval activity in the South China Sea and a significant rise in military flights into Taiwan's air defense zone. The rhetoric from top officials has shifted from talk of peaceful reunification to increasingly aggressive posturing. It's the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. When the economy collapses, find an enemy to blame. When citizens start questioning their government, give them a foreign threat to fear instead. But here's what's truly terrifying. History shows that when authoritarian regimes face internal crises, they often look for external enemies to blame. China's increasing military aggression, territorial claims, and threats against Taiwan aren't happening in a vacuum. They're the desperate actions of a regime that knows its economic miracle is turning into a nightmare. There's a direct correlation between China's internal economic stress and its external belligerence, explains Dr. Elizabeth Economy of the Hoover Institution. The more pressure the Communist Party faces at home, the more it needs a foreign adversary to distract its population. And unlike previous global powers in decline, China has nuclear weapons, the world's largest military force with 2.035 million active personnel and a leadership structure that fears losing control more than anything else. The truth about China's population lie isn't just reshaping one country, it's rewriting the future of the entire world. The truth is undeniable. The China we've been told to fear was built on deception, not just propaganda aimed at the outside world, but a fundamental misrepresentation of its own economic and demographic reality. What we're witnessing is not just another downturn in a business cycle, it's the unraveling of the greatest economic mirage in modern history. Former Chinese Premier Li Keqiang inadvertently revealed this in a private conversation leaked to foreign diplomats, saying China's official GDP statistics were man-made and for reference only. He personally relied on electricity consumption, rail cargo volume, and bank lending as more reliable indicators of China's true economic condition. By those measures, China's economy is already in deep trouble. The reality is that China's economic miracle ended years ago, says Dr. Michael Beckley of Tufts University. What we're seeing now is the lag between economic reality and global perception. China isn't rising. It's already rotting from within. Empty apartments worth trillions sitting vacant. Ghost cities built for millions with no residents. A workforce that's been shrinking for nearly a decade. Local governments so broke they're paying workers with groceries instead of money. The social instability this creates is Beijing's worst nightmare. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests almost entirely on delivering economic prosperity. When that vanishes, what's left? Xi Jinping seems to know the answer, which explains China's
China's massive investment in surveillance and security technology. The regime now spends more on internal security than on its military, a telling statistic about what truly frightens Chinese leadership. This isn't some distant future threat. The collapse is happening right now, in real time, and the consequences will reshape our world. So what do you think? Is China's decline inevitable, or can Beijing somehow turn things around? And how will the truth about China's population lie affect global markets and security in the next decade? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out 17 facts about China's collapse that seem fake but are 100% real. Or click this other video instead. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos that expose the shocking realities behind today's biggest global stories. Thanks for watching.
Something strange just happened in China, and it's not something you'll hear about in the news. The headline is too humble to go viral, but it's much more dangerous. In January 2025, China began to raise its retirement age for the first time in 70 years. It's a sure sign that the biggest economic miracle story of the past half-century is nearing its end, and Xi only has himself and the Communist Party of China to blame. To find out where the trouble begins, just go around China and look at the people. Suppose you were able to get a representative group of the population to pose for a snapshot. Now imagine you had traveled there a decade ago and took a similar snapshot. Compare the two pictures and you'll notice something surprising. There would be a higher proportion of elderly people than there were in your 2015 picture. That's because the population here is aging. The median age in China is 39.1 years as of 2023. That doesn't sound so bad, and it's not. It's only a year older than the United States, but it's going to change fast. By 2035, the Chinese median age will be 5 years older than the United States. By 2049, when Xi hopes China will pass the U.S. as the world's most powerful country, the median Chinese person will be 51.9 years old, a full decade older than the median American. It only gets worse from there. So raising the retirement age is inevitable. Over the next 15 years, it will bump up to 63 for men and between 55 and 58 for women. The measure was controversial and took a lot of doing to pass. Unfortunately, it's just an act of kicking the can down the road. It's safe to bet that it probably won't take another 70 years before the Chinese government has to adjust its retirement age again. There are already 310 million people over the age of 60, full 22% of China's population. To put that into perspective, the U.S. population on July 1, 2025 was about 342 million, according to its Census Bureau. This ticking demographic time bomb is all due to one policy that was as destructive to China's future as anything Mao implemented. Ironically, it came from the leader who was supposed to have rescued China from the miseries of Maoism. In 1978, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, he presided over one of the poorest countries in the world. The Chinese economy was only 3% the size of the United States. By 2012, when Xi took over, it had grown at an average rate of 8% a year. By 2022, 770 million people had emerged from poverty. If only the Chinese leadership could sit back and enjoy such a remarkable achievement. That's not the case. Deng's regime exacted a terrible and completely unnecessary price. The year after Deng took over, China began its one-child policy. It was supposedly to limit overpopulation. Ironically, the birth rate had already been falling sharply since the early 1960s in the midst of Mao's chaos. But the one-child policy effectively stopped the resurgence that was set to take place in the 1980s. The policy was brutally carried out. Heavy fines, forced abortions and sterilizations, and even infanticide were all on the menu. But the true horror of what China did to itself goes far deeper than the headlines suggested. The one-child policy didn't just prevent births, it warped an entire society. Walk through any Chinese city today and you'll see the aftermath everywhere. There are 35 million more men than women wandering around with no hope of finding wives. That's not a typo. 35 million surplus men, roughly the entire population of Canada, with zero chance of starting families. Why? Because for decades, Chinese families practiced sex-selective abortions and infanticide on an industrial scale. When you're only allowed one child and cultural tradition demands a son to carry on the family name, baby girls become expendable. The psychological damage runs even deeper. Studies indicate that the generation of only child boys often faces behavioral issues, showing less trust, competitiveness, and conscientiousness compared to peers. An entire generation of spoiled little emperors who never learned to share, never had siblings to compete with, and now struggle to function in marriages and workplaces. But here's where it gets really dark. Millions of children simply don't exist on paper. They're called heihaisi, black children. These are the second and third children that families hid from authorities. Kids who grow up without birth certificates, without access to schools, without any legal identity. These children are not integrated into their family's hukou, the Chinese household registration system. This hinders their access to basic needs such as medical care, education, or employment. Imagine growing up as a ghost in your own country. The geographic impact was devastating too. Rural families, desperate for sons to work the land, faced an impossible choice: follow the policy and risk having no one to carry on the family name, or violate it and face financial ruin. Civil servants and employees of government-affiliated organizations faced an even starker reality. They risked losing their jobs if they were found to have had more than one child. The Communist Party made it clear: your career or your family, pick one. Some families tried to game the system. They'd register their son with the government while keeping daughters hidden. Within the context of the one-child policy and the preference for sons in traditional Chinese society, many families reserve hukou registration for their sons, even if their daughters are older. The policy created something even more sinister: a massive human trafficking network. As many women from Myanmar cross the Chinese border, they're sold to single Chinese men desperate for wives and children. Many of the trafficked women are told that once they produce a child, they're free to go, under the condition of leaving behind their child. This isn't just about demographics, it's about the complete breakdown of social trust when a government turns families against themselves. And the cruelest irony? Much of China's fertility decline was realized prior to the launch of the one-child policy under a much less strict policy in the 1970s. China crushed millions of families for a policy they didn't even need. But it's too late for regrets. Now Beijing wishes all those people had been born. If they were around, China's aging problem would be much less severe, and the pension system might not be in so much trouble. In 2019, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences issued a dire warning. If something wasn't done fast, they said, pension money might run out by 2035. China's pension program is structured along 3 pillars. The first is a basic pension for urban employees. Participation is mandatory for ordinary employees based on defined contribution rates for them and their employers. 536 million people were part of this system at the end of March 2025. But there's a loophole. Self-employed, flexibly employed, or rural workers who don't have eligible employment contracts only contribute voluntarily. So far, so good, because 535 million of them participated in this pillar of the pension system in 2025. But here's where the loopholes start to widen. The second pillar is left to the private sector. Companies create their own pension funds for employees. The third pillar is up to private individuals who can invest in financial products like insurance. Unfortunately for Beijing, participation in both of these pillars is low. The government is trying to increase awareness of these programs, but Beijing is running up against big headwinds. Once you're done taking the snapshot of China's median age, ask the younger people you come across to talk about why they might be reluctant to participate in their country's pension system. They'll tell you they aren't stupid. They know that the retirement age will inevitably need to rise higher again before they see any benefits, so the logic goes, what's the point of paying into it? But their reluctance to participate doesn't stop there. There's another reason, and it puts the Chinese government on the horns of a dilemma. If more young people participate in the pension system, it might be in better financial shape, but it might also lower the country's birth rate even further. China's young, working-age population has another frequent complaint. They're increasingly expected to take care of both children and their aging parents. Force them to pay too little into the pension system and it might collapse. Force them to pay too much and they might have even less of an incentive to have children. But the problem still gets deeper because they'll also have less money to spend on other things, and that could make things really dicey for the higher-ups in Beijing. And by dicey, we mean stopping a badly needed economic transition cold. But financial numbers alone don't capture the full crisis. Beneath the pension data lies something even more critical: trust. And that brings us to Beijing's bigger gamble. Let's turn back the clock a few months. It's December 2024, and Xi Jinping is speaking before the Central Economic Work Conference, the most important annual meeting of economic policymakers in China. He's laying out plans for nothing less than a revolution in the country's economic profile. At the conference, Xi said, efforts should be made to vigorously boost consumption, improve investment efficiency, and expand domestic demand on all fronts. In other words, his top economic priority is to turn his country into a consumer-driven economy. There's just one problem with this vision. It has no hope of success because it would require the Chinese Communist Party to turn its back on the way it runs the country. And that's exactly the kind of economic contradiction we love digging into here. If you're enjoying this deep dive, subscribing really helps this channel a lot, and we've got much more to uncover about where China's headed. Now, back to Xi's impossible challenge. Exports were the foundation for China's rapid economic miracle. They grew rapidly after Deng came to power, peaking at 35.5% of the country's total GDP in 2006, according to the World Bank. For the Communist Party, this model was perfectly adequate. It let them sell goods to the rest of the world, they and their loyalists got to keep the profits, and the economy kept growing. But this system had a flaw. It required the cooperation of foreigners who were ignorant of China's way of doing business. Exports started to decline sharply during the Great Recession. That was to be expected, but they never truly recovered to their pre-recession highs. In 2023, China exported 19.1% of its GDP. Why? When Xi came to power, he began to take a much more aggressive approach to foreign policy, and formerly optimistic trading partners began to get worried. China's behavior in the COVID-19 pandemic, when it threatened to withhold critical medical supplies, made things worse. So countries saw an increasing need to get their manufacturing out of China, and when President Trump returned to power, tariffs were at the top of his agenda. Chinese goods became much less competitive, and it's now happening much faster than Beijing can cope with. Exports to the United States dropped by 34% in May 2025. The formerly insatiable demand for cheap Chinese products is drying up as public opinion of China has soured under Xi, and trading partners begin to prioritize their security concerns. Now China doesn't have a choice. Its export-driven growth model came when people around the world were optimistically expecting it to liberalize its political system in line with its approach to trade. The world got a huge Chinese military buildup, routine intellectual property theft, and a more authoritarian China instead. One solution for its economic challenges might be for China to ease tensions with the West, but that would mean giving up on its superpower ambitions, like taking over Taiwan, and Xi can't have that. That's why he's looking at the 770 million people that came out of poverty before he took over. If they buy more stuff, China's economy can readjust. But how close is Xi to achieving his goal? The numbers tell the story, and there's good and bad news to go around. The good news is that China's National Bureau of Statistics says that in 2023, the country's GDP grew by 5.2%, and increased consumption contributed to 82.5% of the total GDP growth, 4.3 percentage points overall. The bad news, despite consumer growth, China still had a record trade surplus of almost $1 trillion in 2024. It's a sign of just how big of an obstacle Xi faces. China's explosive growth may have seen it become the world's second largest economy, but internally, it doesn't look the way that such a rich country should. Despite the emergence of its people from poverty, World Bank data shows that China's real GDP per capita was still only $12,951 in 2023. That's about twice as much as it was when Xi took over, but once again, he can't so easily celebrate his country's progress. Growth there has stalled since 2021. Remember that snapshot you took? Ask the younger people about their prospects and they'll tell you why. They'll say that these days it's hard to find a job you can rely on to provide a steadily growing income. And they're right to feel that way. Only 3 sectors are sure to provide it now. Workers in mining, information technology, or utilities companies are fine for now. Wages there are rising faster than the annual GDP growth. Everywhere else, it's a different story. The national growth rate exceeds the growth of income by workers, and since China's economic growth has only averaged 5% since 2020, low by its lofty standards, the average employee can't expect to see much growth in disposable income. And that means China's consumers will be hard-pressed to spend more money as the years press ahead. China's consumption share of total GDP was 53.4% in 2023. That's even less than it was in 2015, when it was 53.7%. Little wonder why the confidence of Chinese consumers is dropping. Reporting from the People's Bank of China clues us in on just how challenging a task Xi has in front of him. As of late 2024, 61.4% of Chinese households are clenching their wallets shut, saving instead of spending, a death knell for Xi's consumer dream. On average, Chinese citizens save 40% of their income, and when they are willing to spend money, it's not on consumer goods. Instead, it's on education and healthcare, the latter of which will inevitably grow as a portion of personal expenditures in China thanks to a rapidly aging population. Tourism was the only luxury that Chinese individuals seem to be willing to open their wallets for, but that doesn't help Xi on his quest to reduce the country's export dependency. A comparison with the United States helps to make China's long-term problems clearer. Real GDP per capita across the Pacific was $82,769 in 2023. Americans have a lot more money to go around, and they make it go around. World Bank data shows that consumer spending makes up about 70% of the overall U.S. GDP. It's a similar case in Japan, which also struggled to raise its consumer expenditures between the 1980s and 2000s. But Japan's real GDP per capita was already more than twice China's current level by 1990. And even during its so-called lost decade, consumer spending continued to grow steadily. China is starting its journey to a consumer economy in a much worse place than its Japanese neighbor thanks to its significantly lower GDP per capita and a much more elderly population than even Japan had at the time. There is a way out of the age part of that problem, at least in theory. Beijing is encouraging a so-called silver economy, where elderly people spend more to keep aggregate demand healthy. This isn't something coming out of the blue either. Elderly populations in wealthy countries have more money to spend than their younger counterparts. Unfortunately for Beijing, that solution can only be temporary at best. An elderly population also means the loss of economic productivity, and with China's pension system already in trouble, it's probably safe to bet that China can't rely on its growing cadre of senior citizens to finance a consumer golden age, at least not as much as Beijing would like them to. That's especially the case because there's something else that China lacks compared to what a normal wealthy country looks like. A silver economy can't work the same way in China as it would in the United States. Why? Because it's still a communist country. A lot of its big companies are owned by the government, so there can be no private investment. Other companies are private, but they're still deeply connected to the Communist Party. There are no 401ks or retirement savings accounts here. In the United States, elderly people can still expect to grow their money through investment income. In China, they can only rely on their savings and whatever they get from the struggling pension system. So there are only two things left that Beijing can do to make itself a consumer-driven economy. The first option is to do the unthinkable, something that hasn't happened before in modern history: go into recession. An economic contraction would allow China's economy to adjust to the new demands, but disruptively. Perhaps too disruptively. It would go against the foundational promise the Chinese Communist Party made to the country's long-suffering population. China isn't a democracy. That doesn't mean there isn't a social contract. The bargain that the party made with its people after Mao was simple. Authoritarian communist rule in Beijing would continue, but in return, the party would guarantee economic growth. So far, the party has kept its word, but not everything is so rosy lately. The party might no longer have a choice to avoid a recession. China's job market is showing signs of weakness. 16 million jobs in the country are tied to the U.S.-related exports that are now dropping fast. China is also rapidly embracing AI, but that means even more job losses and pressures on the Ministry of Finance to dish out employment-related subsidies. $9.3 billion worth of them are expected this year. People in China are deeply concerned about their country's job market, so they're not exactly going to be in a spending mood. You've probably guessed where all this is going. China is staring down the barrel of a deflationary spiral. Both consumer and producer prices are falling, and that downward trend has been there since July 2022. This is really bad news if Xi wants to transition to a consumer economy. Wait a minute. You might think that statement might not make sense. Lower prices should put a risk-averse population in more of a spending mood, right? Yes, but that's just a sugar high. To find out why, just look at one of the symbols that's shown just how much China's moved up in the world. The last time consumer prices rose by at least 1% was in February 2023. That date was probably not a coincidence. China is now the world's largest market for automobiles. Again, that's an achievement. China used to specialize in exporting cheap goods or perishables like fish. Now it's exporting advanced electric cars. But what happens when the demand for those cars abroad is under threat? The only way out for manufacturers is to sell them to people at home at lower prices. So China's car giants like BYD, Geely, and Chery started trying to undercut each other in 2023. Now China's regulators are stepping in, desperately hoping to bring the price wars to an end. Even if they're successful, they're still facing an endless string of challenges because the automotive price wars are just the highest profile instance of what's going on in the entire economy. Producers who now suddenly find themselves with an oversupply of product that isn't being shipped overseas have to lower prices to incentivize antsy Chinese consumers to make up for the shortfall. But if prices stay so long for too long, consumers will start to get even more reluctant to spend because they expect prices to go down even further. With the drop in spending comes a pullback in investment. Companies sit on cash, jobs get shed, and, well, the promise of the Chinese Communist Party gets broken. But hey, there's always the option of encouraging would-be consumers to use debt to finance their habits. China's taken that approach with its development before. All the ghost cities and roads to nowhere were one of the reasons why the economy kept growing at a rapid pace. That was when trading partners were less skeptical about Chinese exports. Debt-financed growth toward consumerism might not be easy now, especially when so many people in China are less than creditworthy. Or Xi could loosen up the regime's heavy hand and let people invest more in private enterprises. But that would mean undermining the Communist Party's control of the country, and he has no interest in that. If it means trying to sail China's aging population and slowing economy between a rock and a whirlpool, so be it. But do you think there could be another way out for Xi's China? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. It makes a difference. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Beijing, January 2030. The latest graduating class, 15 million students, floods into a job market that collapsed 3 years ago. Youth unemployment has officially hit 35%, though independent economists estimate it's closer to 50%. But here's what makes 2030 different from 2025. The youth aren't protesting. They aren't demanding change. They're not even complaining. They're calling themselves rat people and celebrating the fact that they've given up entirely. Marriage rates have collapsed to near zero. Birth rates have flatlined. An entire generation lives with their parents, proudly doing nothing and turning unemployment into performance art. What you're about to discover isn't science fiction. It's the inevitable endpoint of trends that started in 2021, accelerated through 2025, and are racing toward this dark reality right now. Over 12 million fresh graduates flooded into a job market gasping for air in 2025, a record unmatched in recent history. Youth joblessness has refused to dip below crisis levels for over a year. The lying flat and let it rot movements have evolved from viral catchphrases into generational manifestos. This isn't just economic failure. This is the systematic creation of a lost generation that could bring down the world's second largest economy, and it's happening faster than anyone predicted. The countdown to 2030 has already begun. Let's start with the brutal reality that China's government tried to hide. In August 2023, something unprecedented happened. China simply stopped publishing youth unemployment data. Why? Because the numbers were so catastrophic they became a national security threat. The last official figure before the blackout? 21.3% youth unemployment in June 2023. That's 1 in 5 young people with college degrees who couldn't find work. But here's where it gets truly shocking. When China resumed reporting in December 2023, they used a completely new methodology that magically made the crisis look smaller. They excluded students from the count entirely. Convenient, right? Despite Beijing's statistical manipulation, unemployment among young Chinese has consistently hovered between 17% and 20% throughout 2024. And that's just what they're willing to acknowledge publicly. Independent analysts estimate the real number reaches 25 to 30% when you include underemployment and graduates working jobs that require no degree at all. Here's what should keep Beijing's leadership awake at night: 430,000 more desperate degree holders than 2024's already overwhelming flood, all competing for positions that exist only on paper. Think about that scale for a moment. That's more new graduates than the entire population of Belgium, all competing for jobs that simply don't exist. But the unemployment crisis is just the beginning of China's youth nightmare. Something extraordinary happened in 2021 that changed Chinese society forever. A young man named Luo Hezhang posted a simple message on Baidu Tieba, one of China's largest online forums. His post was titled "Lying Flat is Justice." In it, he described his decision to reject China's brutal hustle culture and live a minimalist life, doing only the bare minimum to survive. "I can just sleep in my barrel enjoying a sunbath like Diogenes," he wrote, "or live in a cave like Heraclitus and think about logos." His post went viral instantly. Tang Ping, lying flat, became the rallying cry for millions of burned-out Chinese youth. But the government panicked. State media denounced lying flat as shameful and poisonous chicken soup. They deleted Luo's original post. They censored discussion groups. They even banned the sale of lying flat merchandise online. The crackdown only made the movement stronger. By 2022, a new, even more nihilistic phrase emerged: Bailan, let it rot. If lying flat meant doing the minimum, letting it rot meant actively embracing decline. Young people started posting things like, "Properties in Shanghai too expensive? Fine, I'll just rent all my life." Or, "Hard to find a job after graduation this year? Fine, I'll just buy lawn, stay home and watch TV all day." This wasn't passive resignation. This was an active rebellion against a system that had betrayed them, and it was about to get much darker. By 2025, the ultimate expression of youth despair had emerged: rat people. These aren't just unemployed youth scrolling aimlessly. Their lives unfold horizontally, curtains drawn, phones glowing, days melting together in digital limbo. They document their existence in tiny, darkened spaces, celebrating the art of achieving absolutely nothing. One young woman documented her 83rd consecutive day of staying in her bedroom, explaining how she convinced her parents that holding a job wasn't building wealth for myself. What makes this movement so dangerous isn't that it's fringe, it's that it's becoming mainstream. But wait until you hear what drove an entire generation to this point. China's youth crisis didn't happen overnight. It's the result of multiple disasters colliding at exactly the wrong time. First, the COVID-19 pandemic shattered China's economic growth model. GDP growth slowed dramatically, and young people bore the brunt of the downturn. Then came the government crackdowns that eliminated millions of jobs almost overnight. In 2021, Beijing banned for-profit tutoring, devastating the private education sector and eliminating tens of thousands of jobs that young graduates depended on. Around the same time, regulatory crackdowns crushed China's tech giants and real estate developers, the very companies that had been seen as dream employers for ambitious youth. Even the gig economy collapsed under its own weight. More than 200 million Chinese work gig jobs, but ride-hailing apps and food delivery services now have more drivers than they need. In some cities, authorities warned there were too many rideshare drivers chasing too few customers. Not even government jobs were safe. Local governments facing budget crises cut civil service positions, destroying the iron rice bowl of secure public employment that had been a backup plan for millions. Meanwhile, China's ivory towers kept churning out more degrees than the job market could absorb, like pouring water into a cracked bucket. In 2024, nearly 12 million new university graduates entered an economy that had no room for them. As one sociologist noted, roughly 25% of recent college graduates are stuck in low-paying jobs far beneath their qualifications. It's a massive waste of human capital and education, but here's the most infuriating part. China's expansion of higher education over the past decade doubled college enrollment, creating millions of youth chasing white-collar dreams that the economy simply can't fulfill. One 30-year-old with a master's degree told reporters that in 2021, she could get job interviews every day. By 2024, she hadn't had a single interview in a month. This is the reality facing China's youth, a perfect storm of economic stagnation, government interference, and impossible competition that has made their degrees worthless and their futures hopeless. But the economic despair is only part of the story. What's really breaking China's youth is the cultural and social collapse that's followed. Chinese youth aren't just rejecting careers, they're rejecting life itself. Meet the 4 no's generation. No dating, no marriage, no children, no home ownership. According to surveys in Guangzhou, 10% of urban youth openly plan to follow this lifestyle, completely abandoning traditional markers of adulthood. The statistics are staggering. What was once an informal safety net has transformed into a deliberate lifestyle choice. Urban family formation has all but evaporated. China's cities echo with weddings that never happened and children never born. This demographic decline has terrified Chinese officials who warn of long-term economic catastrophe if an entire generation opts out of family life. But from the youth perspective, this makes perfect rational sense. How can you start a family when you can't find secure work or afford housing? By lying flat in their personal lives, they're escaping what they see as unrealistic social pressures. As one online comment put it, the next step to look forward to is retirement, meaning young people already feel defeated and ready to withdraw from adult responsibilities entirely. This has created a new social phenomenon, full-time children. These are educated young adults who move back in with their parents and live off parental support instead of working. In exchange, they might do housework or care for aging parents, effectively making family member their full-time job. Once a source of shame, this has become increasingly common and even celebrated online. Some parents, flush from China's boom years, actually encourage it. As one researcher noted, millennials and Gen Z are the first generations in China who can afford to stay jobless and still survive. They half-jokingly call themselves Kenlao, those who gnaw on the elderly, embracing the idea of living off their parents indefinitely. In one viral case, a 21-year-old woman gained internet fame for declaring herself a full-time daughter after quitting her job. Her father even gave her an employment contract with a monthly stipend to stay home and keep him company. While meant humorously, these stories represent something much darker, a collective struggle from millions of young people who've concluded that if success is out of reach, they'll settle for comfort and dependency. But the most extreme expression of this youth withdrawal is still to come. If lying flat was passive resistance and letting it rot was active nihilism, then rat people represent the ultimate surrender. This movement exploded in early 2025 as unemployed young Chinese found community in celebrating ultra-minimalist existence. They post videos of themselves doing literally nothing, lounging in bed all day in dark, tiny rooms, scrolling on phones and ordering takeout. What started as sarcastic memes comparing aimless youth to lazy rats has become an embraced identity. These young people mock hyper-productive influencers who post 5 a.m. workout routines by glorifying the opposite, waking up at noon, staying in pajamas, and achieving absolutely nothing. One viral post showed the contrast perfectly. An American Instagram fitness coach bragging about a 4 a.m. run next to a Chinese rat person still lying in bed at 4 p.m., blissfully scrolling on an iPad. The message is clear. In a society obsessed with achievement, refusing to achieve becomes a form of liberation. Social commentators note that while this seems tongue-in-cheek, it reflects genuine frustrations. Many posting as rat people do so to cope with feelings of inadequacy. Seeing others publicly rot away makes them feel less alone about their own unproductive days. Some argue that only relatively privileged youth can afford to be rat people, those with middle-class families who can count on parental support.
It doesn't mean they want to waste their life, one researcher explained. They're probably just taking some time off. But the normalization of complete withdrawal is unprecedented. These aren't just individual cases of burnout. This represents a cultural shift where an entire generation has concluded that participation in society isn't worth the effort. The government is watching this with growing alarm. If you're finding this deep dive into China's youth crisis valuable, consider hitting subscribe to Fall of Nations. Your support helps us continue bringing these important global stories to light. Now let's see how Beijing is desperately trying to fight back. Beijing's response to youth disillusionment reveals just how threatening they consider these movements. State media has published stern editorials insisting that struggle is the brightest color of youth and attacking the lying flat mindset as self-indulgent negativity that must be overcome. When the garbage time of history meme went viral in 2024, suggesting China's best times were behind us, authorities banned it entirely. State media condemned it as insinuating there's no hope and declared it more dangerous than lying flat for spreading hopelessness. Xi Jinping himself has repeatedly urged young Chinese to eat bitterness and serve the nation wherever needed, even if it means farm fields or factory floors. The government has tried both carrots and sticks. They've launched campaigns to create entry-level jobs, offered incentives for companies to hire graduates, and expanded vocational training programs. Some cities have provided stipends to unemployed youth or arranged mass job fairs. But the most telling response was their attempt to send urban graduates to work in rural areas. In 2023, the Communist Youth League encouraged jobless graduates to roll up their sleeves and go to the farmland. Young people responded with satirical memes of urban graduates posing wearily in rice paddies. As one researcher bluntly noted, the high unemployment rate will not encourage young people to work in the countryside because rural areas do not have the jobs they want. The disconnect between government solutions and youth reality couldn't be clearer. But perhaps the most desperate measure was simply hiding the problem. When youth unemployment data became too embarrassing, China stopped publishing it for 6 months. When they resumed, they changed the methodology to make the numbers look better. This cat and mouse game between authorities and youth has created a climate of cynicism, where even positive government initiatives are met with mockery. The trust gap between China's leadership and its youth has never been wider. Behind the statistics and memes are real young people whose stories illuminate the depth of this crisis. Take the gloomy graduates of 2023. As 11.6 million students graduated into one of the worst job markets in decades, they staged anti-celebration graduation photos, draping themselves limp over campus gates and tossing diplomas into garbage bins. Such dark humor revealed a generation that spent years studying only to face uncertainty. That same month, youth unemployment hit a record 20.8%. Then there's He Jun, who transformed unemployment into internet fame. After losing her teaching job due to the tutoring crackdown, she became an unemployment influencer, turning economic failure into content creation. Ironically, she found a way to monetize unemployment itself, earning about $700 a month through ads, consultations, and crafts, proving that sometimes giving up on traditional employment can become employment itself. Another trend emerged from pure desperation: knowledge street vending. Highly educated young people set up roadside stands to sell intellectual services, a satirical twist on street food vendors. One viral photo showed a London School of Economics graduate in a busy Chinese city square with a cardboard sign offering consulting on Russia-Ukraine relations and modernization theory. Soon, others followed. Psychology graduates offering quick counseling sessions, literature majors writing poems for passers-by. This blend of humor and harsh reality represents creative attempts by jobless youth to feel useful despite being overlooked by the formal job market. City authorities have even loosened street vending rules to encourage entrepreneurship, implicitly acknowledging that not everyone will find corporate jobs. These individual stories paint a picture of a generation smart enough to recognize diminishing returns on effort and exhausted enough to stop trying entirely. But perhaps the most revealing voices come from those who've embraced lying flat as a philosophy. A 29-year-old named Sal Hang explained to reporters, "Unlike my parents' generation, we cannot make any long-term plans for our lives anymore because we do not know what is going to happen to us even 5 years down the road." After endless office failures, despite hard work, he decided to do the bare minimum and stop stressing. His conclusion? Dropping ambitions was the only way to stay sane in a system designed for him to lose. Another young professional, Anna Wang, quit her bank job after enduring 12-hour days for minimal pay. "I was doing 3 people's jobs," she told Reuters, for only 6,000 won a month. Rather than cling to the iron rice bowl of state employment, she walked away and felt solidarity when she saw lying flat trending online. These aren't stories of moral failure. They're accounts of rational actors recognizing that the game is rigged and choosing not to play. The implications of China's lost youth generation extend far beyond individual stories of disappointment. What once passed for economic progress has corroded into generational paralysis. The psychological foundation that sustained China's growth, the belief that effort leads to advancement, has shattered completely. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party maintained legitimacy through a simple bargain: accept authoritarian rule in exchange for economic prosperity. As long as each generation did better than the last, people tolerated restrictions on political freedom. But now that bargain is crumbling. When an entire generation concludes that hard work doesn't lead to advancement, the psychological foundation of China's growth model collapses. The economic consequences are already visible. Entrepreneurship and innovation decline as youth opt out. Consumer spending stagnates as young people embrace minimalist lifestyles. The demographic time bomb accelerates as marriages and births are deferred indefinitely. Perhaps most dangerously, the lying flat mindset is spreading beyond youth. According to reports, even some private entrepreneurs and government officials are lying flat by not pursuing new ventures, further dragging down economic growth. But the political implications may be even more significant. Young Chinese increasingly see the political system as offering no meaningful channel for their grievances. Student activism is stifled. Independent organizations are co-opted, so they express dissent through withdrawal and sarcasm. Online, they've developed coded language to evade censorship. When authorities banned garbage time, young netizens referenced it in increasingly subtle ways, turning censorship itself into a form of resistance. The viral phrase, "we are the last generation," trending briefly after a video showed a young man telling police he refuses to carry societal burdens to the next generation, encapsulates this hopelessness about the future. The result is a sullen standoff. The state promotes patriotic struggle while youth quietly mutter "let it rot" under their breath. This growing alienation between China's leadership and its youth represents a crisis of legitimacy that no amount of economic stimulus can fix. China's youth crisis isn't just a domestic issue. It's reshaping global economic and political dynamics. When the world's second-largest economy faces demographic collapse and a generational withdrawal, everyone feels the effects. Supply chains built on cheap Chinese labor become unreliable as young workers embrace rat people lifestyles. Consumer markets that depend on Chinese demand stagnate as an entire generation chooses minimalism over consumption. The brain drain is accelerating too. Applications for emigration hit record highs in 2024 as China's best and brightest seek opportunities abroad. Wealthy families send their children overseas and move their money with them. This represents both a talent loss and capital flight happening simultaneously, exactly what China can least afford during an economic transition. Meanwhile, China's traditional role as a manufacturing powerhouse faces fundamental challenges. The lying flat generation isn't interested in factory work, even as the country struggles to move up the value chain to higher skilled industries. The geopolitical implications are equally significant. China, dealing with massive internal youth unrest, may become more aggressive externally to distract from domestic problems, or more inward-looking and unstable. For countries that have built their economic strategies around Chinese growth and consumption, the prospects of a lost generation permanently withdrawing from economic participation represents an existential challenge to global growth models. This isn't just China's problem anymore, it's becoming the world's problem.
Which brings us back to that dark scenario we opened with. Beijing, January 2030. 15 million graduates enter a job market where unemployment is openly acknowledged at 35%. But by then, the government has stopped trying to hide the crisis because managing it has become impossible. The Rat People movement has evolved into entire communities of young adults who've completely opted out of traditional society. Multiple generations live in extended family compounds, with grandparents saving, supporting adult children, and grandchildren who refuse to work. Marriage rates have effectively reached zero among urban youth. Birth rates have collapsed so completely that China's population is shrinking by millions per year. For millions of young Chinese, the cost-benefit analysis of adulthood simply doesn't add up. Why join a race when the finish line moves every year? The Communist Party maintains power through increasingly authoritarian control, but governs a society where the largest demographic group has effectively seceded psychologically from the system. This isn't inevitable, but it's where current trends lead if nothing changes. And based on everything we've seen so far, Beijing seems incapable of addressing the root causes of youth disillusionment. The evidence couldn't be clearer. China is creating a lost generation through its own policies and systemic failures. The lying flat and let it rot movements aren't just internet memes. They're symptoms of a society that has failed its young people so completely that millions have chosen withdrawal over participation. When a quarter of college graduates work jobs beneath their qualifications, when youth unemployment stays above 17% for over a year, when marriage and birth rates collapse, when an entire generation embraces doing nothing as a lifestyle, these aren't temporary setbacks. This is a systematic breakdown. The most tragic part? Much of this was avoidable. China's regulatory crackdowns on tutoring and tech eliminated millions of jobs unnecessarily. The expansion of higher education without corresponding job creation set up millions for disappointment. The 996 work culture and impossibly expensive housing made traditional success markers unreachable for most. But instead of addressing these root causes, Beijing has chosen to blame the victims, censor the symptoms, and hide the data. The government's proposed solution, sending graduates to rural areas, promoting patriotic struggle, offering modest job training, completely missed the scale and nature of the crisis. When millions of young people are essentially declaring psychological independence from your system, creating a few thousand jobs isn't going to solve the problem. China's youth have sent a clear message. The current system isn't working for them, and they're not going to keep pretending it is. The question now isn't whether China will have a lost generation. It's how large that generation becomes and how it reshapes Chinese society. Based on current trends, we're looking at potentially 200 to 300 million young Chinese who have fundamentally checked out of traditional economic and social participation. That's not just a demographic crisis. That's the end of the growth model that made China a global power. 2030 isn't some distant dystopia. It's next semester's graduation ceremony, where millions more will receive degrees that guarantee nothing. So what do you think? Are we witnessing the beginning of China's demographic collapse? Or can Beijing find a way to re-engage a generation that has essentially given up on the Chinese dream? Will this lost generation eventually find their way back to productivity and optimism? Or is this the new normal for a country that built its legitimacy on the promise of ever-improving prosperity? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the global trends that are reshaping our world.